All right, here we are, recording. And okay, so we're going into phase two. I thought that would be more dramatic if I called it that, and it's accurate in a sense, but for sure. But I thought it, kind of give a rhythm to things, which I like to do, a little bit of a storyline and so forth. I on this slide, just a quick slide here. We're going to be spending some number of sessions, however long it takes, to really deal well with this issue of kind of foundational knowing, how to gain clarity, the method of knowing, however we want to call it. We can name it after several sessions. You can have a sense of what we're talking about in retrospect. Um, but the one bottom line of it is that given that sometimes we get good results or feel good or things work out the way we thought they would, and given that other times they don't, right? Then, and given that some people have false beliefs, and sometimes we have false beliefs, and sometimes we have limiting beliefs, which is a belief, right? That is false in the sense that it seems kind of like final or like it has to be that way, but we could expand it. So in there, what's false is that the limiting nature of things. Um, Given that that's obviously the case, then um, we want to be able to distinguish better and better ahead of time what ideas are going to be correct, what plans are going to work, what beliefs are true, and in our own mind, what beliefs are false, and that relates to contradictions and so forth in our mind, and dissolve those. Or like I referred to before the recording, before recording, is if we have a situation or a person or even just a conversation that's kind of a mixed bag. Maybe we're talking about something or trying to solve a problem that we need to solve with somebody, but at the same time, it's kind of getting unpleasant, right? Or we want to get someone to do something and it's important in the sense, and important must mean that there's some good if the person does what we ask, but then we're not quite sure what's going to be the right way to communicate with them in order to have that good result. And we start to do it, there could be a mixed bag in that communication experience and situation. And the better we can figure out ahead of time, or at least a split second ahead of time before the words come out of our mouth, what would be better to say, what would be better framing, then we're going to be better off. If the world was such that everything was as it appeared to be all the time, if we hoped for someone to do something and we would just say, could you please do this? And if it was good, that like we wouldn't even feel like asking them to do it unless it clearly was good. They would receive it as good, look at doing it, see that it was good, and just do it, right? If the world was that way, if someone, I guess people couldn't make a mistake in that world in the first place, but if the world was such where we could spot someone doing something that's a mistake and just tell them, and they would feel happy about that and be like, no, that's great, thanks for correcting me, and go do it. But the world doesn't work that way, right? We constantly, even if we feel confident that a lot of times we get things right, clearly we also get things wrong or don't know what to do, or and things don't always turn out the way we expect, and we experience bad results sometimes, bad emotions, and those are tied together as well. So given that things are not as they seem, and pretty pervasively, right? Not visually, things work out just fine, typically, right? In terms of walking around in the world and so forth. Even if once in a while we could show a visual illusion, it's not that big of a deal. But or at least in a lot of cases it's not. But in general in life, when we're dealing with people in our minds and planning and all sorts of stuff like that, then then we don't, how things seem isn't how they are, right, consistently. And so having a method or a knife to start to distinguish that becomes critically important. And really, until we can distinguish that, then how are we supposed to think more quote unquote practically or on the surface? Right? How are we supposed to make plans if we don't have a way to really tell whether we're thinking correctly about the plans? All right, so that's kind of the idea of knowing, or that gives it more of a sense of it. Of course, I've referred to it all the way through in Alchemy. I've been saying that I'm getting to this point, and based on experience, I felt like it was going to be very helpful to do what we did already. I didn't mean like exactly 8 webinars or not, but just talk about goals and strategy and foundationalism and just the types of things we talked about. And I think that kind of got us kind of more in sync together, more having just bridged together and so forth, where we could start to go directly after this. I can also, just from experience, if I try to just go directly after this with people, there's just kind of no foothold or no kind of meeting of the minds that's powerful enough to really get through this in a way that really works for people all the way. I can also tell you from experience and testimony of my experience that knowing, although it might take a little while to go through the stuff in several webinars, well, instead of saying and, I'll say this is basically how I make money. Like as I mentioned a few webinars ago, in essence, there isn't really some other main talent that I've used to make money. It's this method of distinguishing that allows me to come in and design things well. It allows me to just design even an interaction, one particular interaction with somebody well. It allows me to help put other people in a position where they're using their talents and strengths, and where they're not having things that bother them and drawbacks. It allowed me to help design something where people that buy the product will then go on to have success with the product. So kind of for customers, members, for joint venture partners, and for myself, for the business as a whole, designing things and interacting with people, and also just kind of subconsciously, subliminally coming across, not on purpose, but just from a core where people feel a sense that they want to keep working with me and so forth. And so that's what you're going to get out of all this. I also wrote here on this slide, norms and standards drag or accelerate. So that might be a kind of a vague thing right now, although I do have recordings on what I call the master key, which has to do with norms and standards. The point here, just for now, I'm not going to get much into this. I'm going to come back and get to this in the future fairly soon. But I figured out within it was about half a year ago or so, that it was something I was looking for, and I understood so much of it, but it didn't like fully clarify or click for me until then. And that is that there's this ideas of norms and standards. This is kind of what our self-image is made up of, in essence, and it acts as a sort of super goal or meta goals that pull on our other more surface goals that we're aware of. And I refer to this here and there, but things like how much money we make, there tends to be a pull on it, or even our weight at a particular phase in our life, how much we weigh, our general health, and what we expect out of relationships, if it's normal. This has to do with also like your feeling of how things kind of should be, not ideally, but sort of like realistically. And and I'm giving you kind of a shortcut for noticing your own norms and standards. Like if someone's mean to you and rejects you, ideally no one would affirm that that's how things should be. But for a lot of people, they feel like that is how it should be realistically, like they should be rejected. Or if I had a question, actually probably two different questions for people going through Alchemy that have to do with the general topic of self-sabotage, guilt, and shame, and there's probably had some others too, and I'm sure this applies to many of us, or all of us actually on some level. And feeling guilty or feeling ashamed, which actually can be like physically painful as well as just like in our mind, so to speak, and debilitating, and certainly affects our goals and what we strive for. That also is like we can only feel guilt or shame if we feel like we should, right? You see, and so again, people would affirm ideally, sure, I don't want to feel guilt and shame, and they'll actually ask. They'll say, how do I go about not feeling guilt and shame anymore, or in this circumstance, in this ongoing circumstance? But on the other hand, in order for them to feel it in the first place, there's got to be this norm or a standard, this kind of meta goal inside their core, inside their self-image, where in this circumstance they should feel guilt or shame, right? So they have that norm or standard. Those are really deep. Our core idea or image of ourselves is very deep, but happily it isn't all the way deep. It's not foundational. And like with Alchemy, if we can get beneath it, and this is the only way to do that. Any other type of help will try to come like on top of it and struggle against it, and maybe give a model that can like fit on top of it, like capping a well or redirecting like a stream. And for some people, for some time, in some instances, that can work. But it's not assured to work, and it tends to need maintenance and so forth. And that's pretty much what like every other method is doing. And that's completely valid in and of itself. But as always, what I'm giving you, at least what I'm asserting I'm giving you, is a whole different type of strategy that you can add, and that will work it might take time, but the time is spent understanding, and maybe struggling, but to understand and to clarify. But if you get clarity, then you can dissolve things from underneath, and then very differently permanently, rather than just be trying to find a model or a mindset, or keep listening to tapes from different people or the same person that kind of get you feeling empowered again, or whatever it might be. You can still, by the way, do those things after you dissolve issues, but then you can benefit even more from people that have an empowering mindset, and there's plenty of great teachings out there, plenty of great stuff that people have observed and figured out, and synthesized and so forth. But Alchemy, and what we'll talk about in the next several webinars, and what we talk about overall, will give you a very different foundation and a different strategy in addition to all that. It's going to give you new options in life, and it's going to make a number of things possible that never would have been possible in terms of dissolving and creating a different core and such. Okay, so one place we'll go after knowing is that we're going to be able to very differently deal with norms and standards for ourselves, and we can redesign them, not just based on feeling what we want, because then anything where you're just like thinking, well, what do I really want? You're actually building that. That's like when I say a model on top of something deeper that you haven't changed. When you're asking, what do I really want? Now, if you're asking it in a way of gaining understanding and clarity, then that is correct. But generally, people aren't really able to do that because they lack so much in terms of figuring out foundation that in order to answer the question properly, they have to dig all the way down and then build back up, and it's just too much for people. And so we'll do that together, and then you can build things properly. All right. And then that'll enable you to set up these kind of meta or super goals in your favor. Instead of dragging against you, they'll accelerate you. Now, you already have some norms and standards that are helping you, right? Or you just be dead already, or screwed up, or even like particularly screwed up or whatever. So you already experience being accelerated in various places in life, right? The very fact that you're on this webinar is you have some pretty great norms and standards to have joined OMG and joined Alchemy and get on here on a Saturday and so forth. Or even if you're listening to the recording, of course, that you're just doing that. So you have all kinds of helpful norms and standards already that are accelerating you, and that those are helping your life. And then you can make it so you pretty much your core is pretty much fully composed of things that accelerate you instead of drag. And then success in every area of life that you choose to focus on is not only can you achieve higher success, but without the same type of effort. Things will be, in a certain way, quite easy. Again, the struggle will be more of a different type of struggle, like a struggle to understand certain things. Even then, it doesn't have to exactly be a struggle. So it'll be a different level of effortlessness, which is good because then you can pour your creativity instead of into maintenance and overcoming drag. You can pour it into growth, including you can pretty much get yourself taken care of, and then your struggle will be, in essence, trying to help other people. And the struggle then is their minds fighting against you, in essence, and that's pretty much, I think it's fair to characterize my life as mostly that. I haven't dissolved all the issues in my own mind, but I have myself pretty well taken care of, especially outside of any kind of direct attacks or violence. Then pretty much my struggle would just be in helping other people at this point, and can be the same for you. And to a large degree, it may well already be that way for you, for sure. All right. And then I wrote here, understanding mind, influence, and creation of value. Okay, so for your career, for example, and this applies to more than that, but this is easy to understand what I'm saying in terms of career. if you understand mind, yours and others, and more fundamentally how it works, as I've already started to indicate, just things like the goalscape and a whole number of things related to that we've talked about. But we'll get even better underneath it, and then as we talk about knowing over the next several webinars. I started right when I've been talking about goals and strategy and goalscape and all that. Then we haven't really gotten to the total bottom of things yet, so we're more talking about it kind of on the way to the bottom, in a good way, the foundation. And then we can kind of go back underneath. I'm being a little metaphorical here, right? But we can kind of get underneath mind and then build back up. And so we'll come back, in essence, to some of the major things that we've talked about, goals and such, and strategy. But we can do it with what we'll be covering, with knowing in mind. And then that'll give you a different type of influence with people in a good way. And also you'll have a better understanding and an easier time thinking of creation of value and creating even more value for other people, which will put money in your pocket and put it in your pocket easier, right? The more value you create, the easier life is, right? All over the place. And I think everyone on this webinar already does plenty of creation of value, but with anything, the more we understand it, the easier it gets, the more we can do. And so forth. So conversion and sales will follow much easier, right? The more we create value, the easier it is to have people buy it, basically. And then we can apply the same thing with a small common sense tweaks. Same thing applies to friendships, romantic relationships, and so forth, right? And then I kind of referred to this already, but you'll have a different, when you're standing on an actual foundation that you're aware of that's correct, then, and your core is built off of that, right? Then you'll have a core of confidence that you don't have to work at, and you don't have to try to think, all right, I want to come across confidently here. It'll just happen. And that's necessary because you can only concentrate on so much at once, right? So if you read a whole book with a checklist of 8 or 20 things about how to do sales or influence people, then trying to keep all those things in mind while you're talking to someone, or even while you're writing a sales letter, is just a lot of mental juggling, and it's distracting while you're trying, and it keeps you from getting in kind of a different type of state where you're kind of immersed in the communication, or you're writing a sales letter and you want to be immersed in like a buying state and in the story that you're explaining and so forth, or if you're on any kind of communication or webinar where you're doing that, and just when you're interacting with people, when you build for yourself this core that you really want, and you just get rid of a few things that you might have in your core now that are counterproductive, then in the moment when you're interacting with someone, then it just comes across. You can't juggle all those things in your mind from a book with 20 things that affect influence, right? And so I try to find these things that simplify, right, where I'm standing in the right place rather than trying to scramble all around in a place that's cluttered and so forth. Okay, so that's a bit where we're going. And today we are going to, this actually be kind of a little bit light topic in a sense. It's sort of deep, but it's sort of light, and it'll just kind of get us talking and thinking in a way that as we continue, we will, it'll just kind of help us. And it's all part of what we need to cover, so it's good. And the general topic will be perception and reality, and you'll see what I mean as I go on. What I'm going to do is cover, there's 3 kind of theories of perception and reality that are mainly out there. One is how we generally function by default. The irony is that all 3 of them can clearly seem to be wrong, and yet we'll tend to default to the first one generally. And then there isn't really a right answer out there, which is interesting. I went and took epistemology after I graduated from UVA. I went back and took one course with their continuing education program. And epistemology is there's 3 main, as far as I'm aware, there's 3 main academic branches of philosophy, like academic philosophy. And those are metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. And epistemology is about this topic, about how do we know what's true. What's fascinating is they don't have an answer, and they feel affronted by anyone who would be actually looking for an answer. Like, that's like heresy. Instead, it's a historical survey of various attempts at answers, all of which is understood to be wrong, essentially. And literally, you'd think I'm kidding or exaggerating, but literally the idea of actually trying to figure out the answer is like an affront. Like who are you to be trying to actually figure out such an answer? It's never been figured out. It basically can't be figured out. This is just a historical survey of a futile attempt to figure it out. And yet it's like a whole branch of academic philosophy. As I say that, it sounds like I must have things wrong, but I mean, you get a textbook, right? That people write them, they're shared in different colleges. It's not just that I went to the one course where they're saying this. This is just apparently, and then any book or survey you read on epistemology, it's the same deal. Where there isn't an answer. And if there was a generally understood answer to how to know what's true, we would just use it. We wouldn't disagree about religion. We wouldn't disagree about politics, except for in pretty simple gray areas. Actually, even the disagreement wouldn't really be disagreement. It would be gray areas. We all understood they were gray. And like if one guy punches another guy just because he feels like it, then what exactly do we do in response, right? There's not like an exactly understandable answer as far as I know, right? We can try to do something approximately even. We could do something about 10 times worse so that we deter it, right? We have a general sense. There's like on the edges, on the extremes, there's sort of a clarity, right? Which is where we don't want to like necessarily execute someone just for that, or even put him in jail for like decades or whatever. And then we take into account their age, perhaps, for sure, right? If they're 4, then everything changes completely, right? And similarly, just totally ignoring it seems odd too, right? So anyway, we can argue politically around gray areas, or at least discuss, but there just wouldn't be this incredible strife, right? Where people just, there's just such craziness. So if it was out there, if there was any kind of sense of how to know what's true, we'd be using it more effectively than we are now, right? And things wouldn't be so wacky. So it's not really out there, and even in academia, there's not even really, people aren't even really working on the question. They're just publishing stuff and getting paid by subsidies, essentially. Okay, so let us continue. But if we were to understand the answer in a way that we could understand that we understood, then that would be, again, like our own little fire walk, right? Like referring to Tony Robbins, where he has people walk on coals, and even though scientifically it makes sense, where it's not like magical, still psychologically it's kind of a wake-up call where you're like, wow, I wouldn't think I could do that, and yet I did, or breaking through a board or something like that. With this, in addition to the very massive practical use of understanding what's true, of understanding how to know what's true, not understanding what's true, but understanding the method of knowing what's true, then we can also think, my goodness, we know this and people don't, and it can be one more reason why we don't let people's judgments or opinions about us affect us in a way that we don't want, right? We can take what we want. We can enjoy their goodness and appreciation and whatever else, caring and love. But if they're just making judgments about us that might make us feel ashamed or might make us feel like we're small or something, we can understand that they have no idea how to even know what's true in the first place. And then we don't do that condescendingly. We just understand, oh, okay. It'd be like if a 3-year-old tells us that we're, if you're an auto mechanic and you know what you're doing fixing a car, and a 3-year-old tells you you're doing it wrong, then you don't necessarily feel like condescending toward the 3-year-old. You just understand that they don't know what they're talking about yet, right? If they're thinking about their Lego car and how you would pull it apart, like if you want to fix something, then you just pull apart the Legos and you put them together, and you know they have that in mind, right? When they're telling you that you're fixing a real car wrong, then you take it just nicely, basically, or irrelevantly. And that's kind of how you can take the judgments of other people, is like that. You understand, okay, they think it's a Lego car. You understand what's going on. And you might even be making a mistake, but then you just would correct it in the future and figure out the contradiction. But their judgments and so forth about what you should do, especially when they're often clearly wrong, then you can just interpret them differently and not have them affect you in a certain way, which really helps. Okay. So let's get into it. I can tell you the three, and then I'm going to give you a fourth, which we'll use to refer to the correct way to look at things. I'll give you the fourth afterwards. But we'll look at naive realism, and then there's something called representative realism, and then there's something called phenomenalism. All right. So naive realism, and it's useful to confront the fact that this is how, by default, our mind will function, our brain will function for us. So this will feel correct a lot, even though we can stop and realize that it can't possibly be correct, and we wouldn't be the only ones. Like, it's anyone who really talks about naive realism, either in a kind of, if they're talking about like with science and perception, or philosophy and perception, then it's universally acknowledged to obviously be incorrect. So we could feel in good company if we also see that it has to be incorrect. Naive realism is the idea that it's easy to see with objects. It's not that important when it comes to the physical world in most cases, but it's easy to see to start with, and then I'll apply it to the important way to see this is with our mind, and with also interpreting communication from other people and so forth. Naive realism is acting on the idea, without really thinking about it, that how things seem is how they are. And I've mentioned, like with another person, then sometimes a person will seem like a jerk to us, or seem like a good person in a way that we trust them, or still seem trustworthy, and we'll just take that as if it's true, without really having a space in between how things might seem and how things might be. And again, I don't even mean that we stop, we say, okay, it seems this way, let me think for a second, okay, yeah, all right, I conclude that it is this way. What I'm saying is there's not even that space. It's just literally it's perceived identically. And we can see this with looking around. People don't look at a computer screen or a tree outside and say there seems to be a tree in front of me. They'll just be like, there is a tree, like I'm looking at the tree, right? So again, first of all, with the physical world, then it looks like there's just this, like you experience the physical world as you experience it, right? Like there's a bunch of hard things, there's a bunch of things that have edges and continuous lines, and there's motion through time and space, right? Things move around, and the world is like made of objects that have color and that sort of thing, and the people generally don't even think about it at all. They just feel like that is real. Again, they don't even conclude that is how things are. There's just seems and is like a one and the same in a lot of cases, without any space in between them to even pause and stop and think about whether that's the case. So that's naive realism. Or someone will say, oh, I just thought of something, right? And so they'll identify with their mind, and for everyone, that identification of themselves as their mind, like they who they are really are, as their mind, as the whatever that thought of that thought. It seems that it was from them that the thought came, right? When their mind gives them a thought, and they don't even think that it could maybe be from something other than themselves, like that their mind is something else, and rather than them, right? So it feels like we are our mind. So when I say you are not your mind, that goes against naive realism. Naive realism, that feeling or that way of looking at the world will make everyone feel like they are their mind, they don't even affirm it in that language. People just take it for granted. They act on that idea that they're their mind nonstop, right? In other words, that when they have a thought, they'll think the thought came from themselves. Or there's not even good language for referring to you as a being, right? Or you, who you really are. Okay. Let me see. I'm going to go to put the Facebook group up here, and if anyone has any questions, I know I covered this well in a certain case just now, but then also you might have some questions or thoughts about naive realism And if you do, then you can ask them so I can clarify a little bit. Oh, that's awesome, Shima. I'm glad. Yeah, I think all of us, right, deal with this idea of guilt and shame and so forth in some way. For some of us, we might be in situations with other people where it's kind of constant. And then with others, it's not a constant, obvious problem, but it certainly pops up. And actually, if we reflect on it, it might pop up more than we think, right? Or we don't experience guilt and shame, but that's because we keep ourselves in certain boxes or limit ourselves from because we don't want to feel guilt and shame by going out as a consequence of going outside the box, right? So it might just limit us without us feeling it. Dave Keyes said, if someone knows that something cannot be known, isn't that claim based on knowing what is or is not true? Yeah, right. If the same thing, David, if someone says, I mentioned this before, but what's this? Hey, Dave. A little picture there. I feel like I'm looking at you. We're looking back at each other. But anyway, yeah, if someone says, well, I have a greater or lesser degree of certainty, but I can't be 100% sure that something's true, but I can have more or less certainty that it all boils down. We're constantly affirming that we have a method by which we can tell what's true, or else we would just sit there dumbly looking around with no sense of anything, right? And yet people don't have a method, and the method they are using is wrong. Just like one of the reasons I'm talking about perception is it's kind of a simpler version for now of knowing in general, because you can apply the same thinking to perception that I just said, where I mean people act as if they can perceive the world with some degree of accuracy, but yet when we try to pin down, well, how is it happening that we're perceiving the world, right? What's the relationship between perception and reality? People are assuming that there's a relationship, or we couldn't interact with the world. And yet, when we try to pin down what that might be, we keep coming up with the wrong answers. And that's interesting, right? And another thing I realized is that in order to understand the right answers about these things, in a lot of cases in life, but especially about this type of stuff that we're covering in Alchemy, I need to show you the wrong answer that you're using now, that seems right now, and that people in general are using. If I don't show the wrong answer, then telling the right answers is not helpful. It basically just gets blocked or occluded or mixed in and diluted with the wrong answer, which also feels right. Like if I tell you correct strategies to use and so forth, or sometimes, plenty of times, we'll hear the right mindset about something from somebody, and despite the fact that we'll hear it and be like, yeah, that's a better mindset, it just won't happen for us, right? Or if I just said, don't feel guilt and shame because it's counterproductive, then that would be in there, but it would just get mixed with things that already seem right that aren't right, and that advice wouldn't be effective. And someone could give a talk with a great story and make you feel like you're powerful and not guilty, not ashamed, and so forth, not afraid, but then it degrades pretty fast, like in a few days or sooner. What was I saying that? Perception. I was just saying, right, that I have to show you how the answer that seems right is wrong, how the normal default answer is wrong, or the normal default way of thinking or perspective is wrong. And that's what most of my effort is in figuring out what to explain on Alchemy, is I need to figure out what the wrong answer is that people are using, show people how it's wrong, rather than just the right answers are compared to that are relatively easy to give. But that's what we're doing, and that's why it takes time also. And I definitely have to do it. I would like it. We would all like it if I could just give a bunch of right answers. But in a sense, I have. I've already told you a ton of right answers, and they're already helping. But I think we all know that there's more that needs to happen for it just to all be effortlessly absorbed and so forth. You and your thoughts are not always one and the same. Well, actually, they're never one and the same. That's what I'm saying. You're never your thoughts. You are not your thoughts at all. And the better I show you, as I'm doing now, the incorrect ways of looking at the world, and then show you the correct way that perception and reality work, then that'll be great. Then we can have a different way of looking at things. Up until now, and still now, but something we'll be coming out of over the next few weeks is, again, we haven't gotten to the foundation of things, so I'm having to talk without that. Bryn wrote, how do you recall a thread of thought after you've momentarily sidestepped, just like before? When I try to do it, mostly just turns blank. Oh, happens to me too. I'll try to think of something that I was thinking of, that like try to find a foothold as normal. It won't always work, but I'll try to find a foothold. So I'll think of something I was thinking a couple minutes ago, or the first thing I can think of that I was talking about, and just start thinking around from there. Which, although in a way that does always work, not in a rush, but the same strategy works for everything you're trying to do. Is you poke around for a foothold, and until you have it, you have to keep poking around. And another time I said, all right, I'll just start talking about other stuff, and then it might come back to me. But what does that do? It ends up poking around anyway. Until I have a foothold, I can't move forward. When you don't have a foothold, you have to sort of let go. There's a way that people kind of feel perturbed that they should have a foothold when they don't. And instead, you want to feel like you should do what you need to get a foothold, but not that you should already have one. That's the way I thought, but put it out there in a safe way to test the waters. That's great, Michael. Awesome. Exactly. Daniel Smith, epistemology, the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. Yeah, that's the from Wikipedia and so forth. And I looked that up also for these things, these naive realism and such that I'll talk about. Okay, I will continue on here. So I can refer back to this, but I just want to introduce you to these things, and then we kind of have them at our fingertips, and then we can go on. Ultimately, I can also just compare them to the right answer, so I'll continue on and maybe do it that way. All right, I pasted a bunch of stuff here just for the fun of it. I may or may not read what I pasted. It's just on, I think I got it off Wikipedia. I might have gotten it off something else from Googling. I was already aware of what this is in the meeting, but I just thought I'd also paste something in. First, I'm not even looking at what I wrote. I'll just talk about my understanding of it. So once we realize that naive realism is not quite right, and as I said, I'll refer back to naive realism, and I'll do so right now again. So let's just think visually in terms of objects, in terms of just like vision in terms of eyes and light waves and physical objects for a moment. Again, the usefulness of this stuff is mainly going to be in dealing with mind and goals, and especially norms and standards, and getting them right. And that's important for me to say, because otherwise when I'm talking about perception and the physical world, it might seem like I'm talking about something that doesn't have a lot of relevance, or where are we going to go with this? And you're basically right. Like, I don't make a lot of money or have great relationships because I navigate differently in the physical world, right? Because I look at trees differently, or something like that. But instead, when I do talk about perception in the physical world, it's just a way of explaining about these terms and these ideas, and that's useful. That's like giving you it's the same as giving any other example, right? That's on a different topic, but it illustrates the concept. And then we'll apply it to places where it's really going to make a huge difference practically in our lives. All right, that said, let's go back to talking just about objects and vision for a moment. So if we look at a tree, then as we start to think about what's going on there, then naive realism reveals itself to be fairly ridiculous. And we can imagine doing this, or I can just use a computer or your iPhone or whatever you're doing to look at what we're doing now. So if you're looking, let's just then talk about looking at an electronic device, right? So you're looking at an electronic device. If how it seems is like how it really is out there, then if you try to keep thinking about that, it kind of stops making sense. And we'll do that together right now. So there's colors, right, that you see, that you're aware of. And if we think of those colors actually existing out there in real life, where there's really like yellow as we perceive it, just sitting there, regardless of whether someone's looking at it, then well, we already don't think that's the case, first of all, from science, right? We think that actually what we're looking at is made up of atoms and molecules, and that's actually 99% empty space, and those are giving off light waves that are affecting like our retinol and different molecules. They'll hit and change configuration in our receptors in our eye, and then that'll send neural signals. And then, have you seen that? Let me. I don't know if I'll look it up, but it's like an equation with a professor on a chalkboard, and he has this big long equation, and then it says like, and then a miracle happens, and then equals, and then it equals, something else. And then so the standard idea of how we perceive the world, like physical world and visually, is that everything I described happens. Neural signals go to our optic center, and some other processing goes on in our brain, and then a miracle happens, and then there's a conscious experience of your iPhone or a tree. So, and they don't phrase it that way, but if you look at what they're saying, that's basically the way it is, right? Like the neurons fire off, and then somehow there is no explanation at all on how that leads to a conscious experience. We just have a sense that it does happen, and therefore it must happen, and so forth. All right. So we already know from kind of our scientific story that it isn't the case that we're just seeing what's there, or else we would see 99% empty space and so forth. If we think of it separately from the scientific way of looking at it, we can still sort of see how it doesn't make sense, possibly. So if an iPhone just existed out there in the world as you see it, and you just see it as it is, then you shouldn't then say that you need to look at it. If it's, and this is a little hard for people to grasp, but it's ultimately correct, and it's something you can think of more about later. If you're seeing something as it is, then why would you have to see it? Why would you have to interact? Why would you have to have a perspective or a lens to look at it? The very fact that you say I look at it, like what if you turn around? Like what if you walk around it to another angle? Or if you think of a statue and you're looking directly at it and you see it as it is, then you walk around and it looks different. So your perspective is obviously mixing with the statue. And then if you imagine it later and you remember the statue, then your experience of the memory is different than when you were just looking at it, right? It might have similarities, but it also has differences. So no matter what, you're mixing your perspective with even physical objects, right? So once again, you're not seeing them as they are. Something's going on where there's a mixing, right? So on the one hand, people will feel like there's really a tree that looks just like it looks out there. And yet, depending on my perspective, it can look different. And then there's different lighting, right? If the lighting could change, right? If one of my cars is midnight blue, if it's dark, it looks black, basically, right? And what happens when something is false is that you can keep delving into it from different angles. Like I can keep this up for like all day, is where I could start to think about things in terms of naive realism, and it would basically stop making sense. Like like as I talk right now, trying to talk to you about whether naive realism is correct, what really ends up happening is we both end up a little bit confused. Do you see that? And there's an even more basic problem that's going on with how people understand the world and reality, where when they start to think about things like this, perception, reality, they just get confused, and so they just want to give up. And because they're starting in the wrong place, they don't realize there's something deeper. So mainly what I just demonstrated is that whenever we try to think in terms of naive realism, we just confuse ourselves, you see. And that in and of itself should be a red flag. When you can't, when anywhere that you turn, you lose, then you need to look deeper at the premise, right, or the foundation. So instead of going on and on about how things don't make sense with naive realism, and we're going to run into the same problem with the other two, is don't even try. It's not that we're not communicating when you feel like, when I start talking about, well, what if, what I just did about looking at an iPhone or a tree, you almost just, you feel like you have some grasp of what I'm saying, but then you probably also felt a bit confused, as did I, right, trying to even talk about it. And then wherever we kind of go with it, we just kind of end up confused or blurry. And when that's the case, something's going on that we need to look deeper, rather than just shying away from it, which is our natural kind of instinct, right? It's just to kind of let it, forget about it. And again, I'll have clear answers for you where things will make sense. And we'll have a very different type of experience as we get it, where we stop running into these problems no matter where we turn. But then that's normally, again, what happens. That's why people give up. That's why in actual real life, in practice, my professor and such was affronted. He was just basically annoyed at me. He felt like I wasn't cut out for philosophy because I was trying to figure out the answer to this stuff. It just kind of basically pissed him off. I mean, he was quite nice and helpful, but a little bit like our own mind, how it doesn't want to go these places because wherever it goes, it just runs into a dead end. But that won't have to happen, actually, once we get it right more deeply. All right, but by showing how we hit a dead end in these ways, then it'll cross them off for you, and you won't have these confusing ideas mixed in with your thoughts. We can get them out. So the second way then that I've had on the screen here is representative realism, which is the idea that what we see as a visual image or like a little virtual reality, mini virtual reality of the world out there, right? Because naive realism can't be correct. We don't see the world exactly as it is. There's not even color in the physical world outside of being imposed on it from our visual system, right? And people believe that. That's like a normal belief, and I'm agreeing with it. So if there's not even color out there in the physical world, in reality, right, with matter and energy, when I say in reality, I mean in what people call reality. I'll fix things a little bit in a little while. So then the scheme that's more close to how people intellectually affirm the world must be is through representative realism, which is, again, this idea that we experience like a visual image of the visual world, the physical world, and we experience like an auditory image of sound, like the audio world, right? Sound waves or the sound that's going on in the world. And there's a way that's more correct than naive realism, but the problem that we quickly run into is that, well, if we're saying that the image is representative of the tree, or it's a little replica of the tree, then all we ever experience, according to that theory, all we ever experience are replicas, metaphors, images, and we never experience the real world out there, right? If I only see a visual image of the tree, or if I remember the tree, or I remember what I saw, then I experience like a memory of the visual image of the tree. And so if my memories are just representations of what happened, my visual experience is a representation, then I actually never see the world out there. And so I don't know how closely the image matches up with the world out there. It may be a little bit like if there was an ambassador from a country that you'd couldn't directly interact with at all, then you wouldn't even know if the guy was really, or girl was really a representative of that country at all, right? You couldn't verify it. So you just have to go by that person's word that they were an ambassador. But so maybe that helps to further see. So it kind of denies that we have any direct experience or knowledge of the outside world, and then it would follow that we don't even have enough knowledge to know whether the representation we have in the world, how much it relates. It's like we have a metaphor without having any idea how close the metaphor is. It would be like if I said, I'm thinking of a number, and now I'm going to think of a related number, 702. So now you know better what my original number is, right? Well, no, right? Because if you have no idea what the relation between 702 and the original number I'm thinking of is, then it doesn't help you. Now, in practice, we do keep having our expectations met. So there is a method that we're using of like approximating or seeing whether things work, right? So there's a way that our whole idea of perception and reality, it works sometimes rather than never. And so it lets us tread water, so to speak. And I'm going to get to this next on Monday. We'll take a little bit of a break is the wrong word. It's going to be an awesome webinar, but it'll be a little bit of a direct standalone topic that'll be helpful. It'll be great. I'll be talking about playing to win and making a unique distinction that would be blocking you from really playing to win properly next time on Monday. But sorry, I was talking about representational realism, the image. How we don't, and then the number, right? You wouldn't know the relationship. Oh, and I was saying that it works. And I was saying about treading water. So these incorrect ways of seeing the world, they're incorrect logically, but there's still a way that even just naive realism works, and so we keep using it. And it's kind of the only thing we have until we figure out the correct answer, or at least some blend of the three that I'm going to cover here, is all we have to work with unless we figure out the right answer. These wrong answers work to a certain degree, and we're given them to start with, right? Like I talked about our starter kit that we started with. Everything about that, and pretty much everything about how people deal with the world, is like treading water. Even when people talk about making the world better, if it's really not framed in terms of winning, it's just making things a little better while we lose, is really how everyone looks at the world outside of alchemy. And again, there could be exceptions. I'm not trying to prove a negative or exclude everyone, but in my experience, I mean, it just constantly boils down to that, and it's helpful to realize that. So at least you can ask the question. You could say, "Wow, is this yet another teacher or guru or philosophy or understanding or perspective that it just boils down to treading water and trying to make us feel a little more comfortable while we tread water until we lose?" And if so, then great. It's definitely better to feel comfortable while we tread water than to feel uncomfortable. It's better for people to be healed and not be sick rather than be sick while we really win for real. But boy, don't we want to also go for the freaking win, right? Doesn't that make life so much more exciting and better? And once we win, then for sure it'll be way better. So to the extent that what I'm covering, these wrong answers work, they work to let us tread water. But clearly they also don't work. They clearly have flaws. And like I mentioned early in this webinar, before I even started to cover these three things, these three perception theories, they also don't work plenty, right? We get plenty of bad in our lives that we don't want, and we feel like there's got to be some way that we can get even better results than we got, right? Or feel like we're on the right track when we are, rather than be doing things that we know are good for us and yet not even want to do them, and feel lack of motivation sometimes, or bad emotions when we're doing something that we like, right? So in all these ways, things aren't working nearly as well as perfect, and so we want to figure out how to do that. I'll read this once here just so people have it auditorially, but then I'll pretty much move on. Because I'm satisfied that I just gave the kind of simple, and that's all we need is simple point of why representational realism isn't the right answer. It's an approximation, but it works to some degree. The idea that we have a visual image of the world that is a metaphor for the world, it works because our expectations are met, right? Like if I reach for my coffee cup, then I'll generally get it. If I would reach for my coffee cup and nothing would happen, like my ham would pass through, or I would, get bitten by a duck, and then leaves would fall on my head, and I look up and I just see a ceiling and no leaves. But then, if the world was just crazy like that, like something Alice in Wonderland or worse, then that would be an example of things working even worse than they do now. But the world works pretty well. But as I mentioned, the world works particularly well physically, not perfectly, right? But pretty well. There's certain things where a deeper understanding of the world, like what we call scientifically, has helped make things like cell phones and so forth. Anyway, so things work. Like when I reach for a coffee cup, I get my expectations met. Typically, my hand seems to grasp the coffee cup, and then I drink, and I get the coffee. My heart rate speeds up. It all happens the way I expect. But then, especially when we're dealing with our own minds and people and getting results in the future, that things don't always happen as we expect, and they certainly don't happen perfectly, ideally. And logically speaking, the logical issue with representative realism, is that if all we experience is images of something that we never interact with directly, then we have no idea how close the image is. All right, so I'll just read this and we'll go on. The world we see, this is like a definition of representative realism that I just lifted from the net just to give one more perspective. Or the world we see in conscious experience is not the real world itself, but merely a miniature virtual reality replica of that world in an internal representation. Thus, we know only our ideas or interpretations of objects in the world because a barrier or veil of perception between the mind and the existing world prevents first-hand knowledge of anything beyond it. That's actually a pretty good definition. It actually made sense to me while I was reading it. I think because we've already been talking about it, like if you're kind of warmed up and it's at the front of your mind. Sometimes I might read something and it doesn't make sense to me as I'm reading it for the first time about something like this with philosophy and so forth. But anyhow, there you have it. You can replay it if you want, but it all kind of captures the same thing. And I covered the main problem with it. The other interesting issue about representative realism is that our minds don't default really toward that. They default more towards naive realism. It's a little helpful to default more toward representative realism and think, wait a second, it kind of puts a nice little space in between what we experience and what seems to be the case and what is. The problem is it doesn't give a way to bridge the space, and so we give up and revert to naive realism mostly. Because it's actually kind of paralyzing. If we're like, well, this person seems like a good person or a trustworthy person, but maybe they aren't. But then if we have no way of resolving that issue, right, then we just go, okay, well, I guess we just have to go with how things seem and treat it as it is. So that's why we keep on defaulting back to naive realism in most cases. But what we can do, just on a very practical level, we can do even better than what I'm about to say. But just as a starter thing, we could have that space between seems versus is, and in a safe time that we have, or space, or just for at least a moment, we can try to double check and think about things from a couple different perspectives. This person seems trustworthy, but wait, what other motives might they have? What are the real pressures on this person? Because people tend to act on the kind of sum total of the pressures that are on them. One of the pressures might be that person has some belief that they have some integrity and they want to maintain that, which is helpful. But then there could be another pressure that they make more money if they do something that's not against our interests, right? And whatever it might be. So you can think about a few, maybe 3 different angles on things, or the 3 most obvious pressures that the person might have on them. And you can generally get to a better guess of how things really are that way than just going with the first perspective that you have. So that's a little bit of a stopgap and useful, and something that even after you fundamentally understand things, you can interact with a lot of situations that way. Because a lot of times you can't really know to begin with, and so you just want to approximate better, or take inventory of what you do know, and that'll narrow down the gray area first. Okay, phenomenalism is going to matter because in success and sort of like New Age philosophy, a version of it will keep popping up. I like Dr. Wayne Dyer. I enjoy reading his stuff, and it gives me food for thought and things to think about. But there's like an element of it in that, for example, in what he writes, or what he wrote. He passed away, unfortunately. So phenomenalism is I'm not even worried about exactly defining it. There's a guy named Berkeley that originated this term, but it isn't so important to define this particular thing as to just take a look at the idea that, well, maybe our mind just creates reality, or maybe in part our mind creates reality, or maybe if we just tune in the right way, or have the right perspective, we can just sort of manifest what we want kind of directly through willpower. The idea in the Matrix, right, that like the spoon isn't really there and that's how I can bend it. Solipsism is like, right, that the world is just only exists in your perception. So people, when they start thinking about perception too much, they sometimes visit this question because the other two don't quite work. And so then they think, well, maybe about this. Maybe it's just all in our mind. And that basically this isn't right either. In order to interact with each other, in order to affirm that other people have power as well, and to have free will, you have to have power. To have power, you have to have free will. They logically go hand in hand. So to affirm that other people have free will, which is pretty important, right? If you deny that, that's a problem. There's a way that other people can't have free will if you, with your own mind, can just create reality directly. Or like if you could just do magic, then even magic would follow its own rules. It would still just be other physical laws, right? Like technological breakthroughs basically function very similar to magic, right? Where new physical laws are discovered or new applications, whatever, right? New things related to the physical world are discovered, then you can get different results. But there has to be a shared external world of some sort in order for us to interact with each other and for other people to matter and for us to be able to care about each other and all that. So I think at this point getting to the right answer is going to help clear some of these things up, but it wouldn't have if I hadn't covered these, then these would keep cropping up in some way. Oh, and the other issue with mind-created reality is that the people coming up with that are identifying with their own mind. So then they're feeling like they can partly create reality. Now, of course, we can influence reality in some way. That otherwise we ourselves don't have any power or free will, and we must. And if you're asking how we must, well, I mean, you can figure it out yourself, or we can keep going. But everything falls apart if we don't have any free will. There's no reason for you to do anything, literally. I covered, after hearing me talk about this, if you haven't heard my my bonus webinar talking about God, it is I cover things that are related to a lot of this stuff, and it's definitely relevant. At some point, if you don't already, you'll come to realize that in a very practical terms, you need to have a sense of what's going on with God in order to have a sense of what's going on foundationally with the world, in order to build up your core of norms and standards, which then affect your goals in a way that's effortless and accelerates you rather than creates drag and so forth. So it's all related. That's why I cover it. To me, it's not about, to me, religion, politics, all this stuff. You understand basically what's important in reality in the world, or you don't. right? And things relating to violence, things relating to God, violence is like politics, God, they're all actually very related to our day-to-day practical life. They're logical related. They touch on these things. If we totally need to ignore morality, what's right and wrong, and when we should, how we act on that, then we can't function. That's relevant when we're talking about guilt and shame and our core and making money. We need to have some sense of where the boundaries are with right and wrong, or else we'll be held back in a very practical, real way. And so that's why it all relates. Anyway, if we what people do is they identify with their mind, right? Just universally, and so then mind created reality mean like they're feeling like they can create it. The correct answer, sure, our mind certainly plays a part in affecting external reality and in affecting our consciousness field, our own experience of reality. But we're not our mind anyway, and so we need to have the right idea of things. All right, I will take a moment, and then we'll get into starting or some amount of sense of the correct answer, and we'll continue to talk about it for a little while, and then we'll continue in future webinars. How you doing, guys? Back here with everyone for a moment. I think I'll get a drink of something just for a moment. Representative realism is also arbitrary since it's an internal interpretation and everyone's can be different. Oh, nice. Thank you, Megan. Excellent. And the Buddhist thought, by the way, is one of those examples that tends to that third thing with phenomenon. Is it phenomenalism? I think that's, yeah, phenomenalism. And there's ways that at least people's interpretations of Buddhist thought keep meandering over into that mind-created reality or illusion. There's ways to interpret the idea of that life is an illusion that are correct, but there's also ways to interpret it, and that people do interpret it that's also partly incorrect. Actually, all three of these wrong ideas are right. That's correct. And arbitrary actually means they're not foundational. Arbitrary and non-foundational are pretty much synonyms, or at least logically related to the same idea. That's pretty funny, David. I'll be right there. This is how to work from home, right? In little comfy sweat shorts that nobody sees unless I get up and get some coffee. Actually, let me bring that cup over here. Oh, we have a lot of people on. This is pretty cool. There's actually more people on the webinar than that were signed up 5 minutes before the webinar. It's an interesting statistic. Usually you get like, I don't know, half or something of the people that register. All right. The veil is one of the true struggles and cause of striving of artists, right? We're trying to portray a truth or beauty as they see it. They're driven to perfect suggestion that offers the best possible chance to reach through perception with an audience. They know that what your eyes see as green and what my eyes see as green could be two different colors altogether. We were just told the same name of the thing in front of us was green. Right. We have all these issues, and again, it's helpful. More the reason I cover these things is so there's a way that this will kind of clear it out, where this won't be confused with what I'm going to talk about here. Oh, energy! I'm going to get to that. It's really cool. I'm pretty excited about giving you the correct answer here, or the. Of course, naive realism, I can't just hand you the correct answer in a way that necessarily is immediately understood, but we can continue until we get it, which is how I do things. I think my head is going to explode. But actually, the fun thing is that the right answer is actually nice, in that it pretty much you can stop having that feeling of like confusion everywhere you look when you try to think about things deeply. Uh, so the head exploding is more from trying to make sense out of nonsense. And so soon we can stop doing that. Jen wrote, "Hi David, how does energy intertwine with all of this? For example, I'm very sensitive to other people's energies. No matter how friendly they are, if they have bad energy, everything in me tells me to stay away. A couple of times in the past, I've ignored my instinct to stay away, and boy, did I learn my lesson. I got burned so badly. How do you deal with these types of situations?" I can give kind of a quick, direct answer to that. Um, my basic strategy in life is that the law of implication, and that I focus on what I can know. So let's suppose that if you're meeting someone, you have a sense that they have bad energy, then you don't know for sure what they're really like. But if you've found that in the past that this has steered you well, then in the moment, that's all that's what you have to go on. I agree. I'd probably just avoid someone that had bad energy, but then I would, like you're doing now, I would also try to understand things even better, so that the more I could accumulate that I know about that type of thing, but that I know, rather than just like evidence and more experiences. Like I'll use what people will do when they're thinking from the surface, or the normal way of thinking that our brains are good at is by default is they take a bunch of information and kind of synthesize it, or glean, or it's almost like they eat a bunch of information and spit out less, or like a synthesis, or an approximation. And our brains are good at doing that for us. And to the extent that I don't know, what I try to do is I narrow things down to where I know as much as I can, and then there's a gray area left, and then I'll let my brain do my brain's method. Um, and so, roughly speaking, you go by your experience when you don't know, and that, because what you best you know is your memory of the experience. But then the more you can figure out that you do know, and with people, what works for me very well with people is looking at the vectors or the pressures on that person. As a simple example of what I mean, someone that is tight on money, that's going to be a very good predictor of how they're going to act with money, and with your money, and with splits of money, and so forth. If someone is and it's better to have kind of your money and theirs kind of quarantined, they might be a terrific person, and they might grow, and they might get out of that situation. So I don't mean I avoid those people altogether, but I kind of make sure I try to avoid having my money mixed with people like that. Or I'm going to expect them to be very influenced by what's going to help them get money right now, and it's going to have an outsized influence on their decisions, things like that. So that works great for me. Is looking at the pressures on people, and I find that to be a very good predictor of how they're going to act. Jeremy wrote, "Are we still building a foundation? Did I miss that? Is the foundation happiness and building on what we can actually know?" That's correct. No, we are. I was basically bridging in what we can call phase one, the first 8 webinars. It's all kind of a rough way of explaining it. But starting in this webinar, I'm going directly after the idea of how we know what's true. To do that, I'm always still bridging in a sense, where I'm starting somewhere, and I'm starting with the idea of perception and reality, and now I'm going to go and to a slide and give you the way to look at things properly. And Alec asked, does this play into the subject of intuition? Yeah, your intuition is generally, when we're talking about intuition, we're talking about what you're feeling is the right way to act, or the right way to, whether with a person, whether you want to get working with them or not, or make a deal with them or whatever, or what action you should take about something. You don't know one way or the other whether your intuition is correct. You can have a sense of whether it's been correct in the past or not. And we can also, one of the things we can pretty much know is that pretty much is still something. I mean, studies have just shown, just over and over and over every time, that we do tend towards overconfidence. So we're going to tend to feel overconfident in our mind's conclusions, including our intuitions. So we still want to narrow down as much as we can know first. And then how you act within the gray area is you can just be doing what you normally do within the gray area. You can listen to your intuition, but you can kind of pay attention and so forth. But there's all sorts of stuff we can narrow down. And you'll see more and more as we continue week after week. All right, so let's call it alchemy, conveniently. We'll name the correct, I just need some word, right? Obviously the word itself is not going to do the whole explanation, but let's call the correct way of understanding perception and reality as alchemy. And I have even referred to this already, but by leading up to things in the way that I have with these wrong answers, then I think we can take a look at this and we can further our understanding. It's not that we need to close the book on this right now or not in this webinar. There's a whole bunch of things foundationally that are logically related that as we uncover more, it'll potentially make more sense out of what we've already covered. All right. By the way, when I write Middle Earth, if you're wondering, I could have capitalized that even. I'm talking about like the world of Tolkien, like the Lord of the Rings, just as an example, as kind of a thought exercise. Okay. So all these perception answers, they're actually built on a deeper issue, which is starting by thinking of the world as being fundamentally composed of matter and energy. Even people that are theists, as I guess most people are anyway, but even if someone's a theist, they tend to think of the world, the universe, as composed of matter and energy, and then God as someone supernatural, like outside of that, and that then can kind of directly manipulate that stuff. But there's a way that we still kind of think based on matter and energy. And then we think of the idea of, well, how do we see it? How do we perceive the real world? And again, the real world being assumed to be, and it's not, but it's assumed to be composed of matter and energy. So we actually screw things up from the start by imagining the world to be composed of matter and energy, or even those being, right, with E equals mc squared, the idea that those kind of boil down to one thing anyway. Some people will say like it's all energy. I'm thinking of, there's many people say this, but one teacher in particular, but I won't name them because you never know what affiliate promotions. Although this person has nothing to do with being our affiliate now, I've never interacted with them. No one that you would be thinking of me thinking of. This one person, just as an example of the type of thing that we might hear, is the idea that well, science has shown with quantum mechanics that matter is interconvertible with energy, and so really who you're actually made of energy. You are energy. You are light. I'm not saying this is true. I'm saying this is an example of what the kind of thing we can hear that's actually incorrect. But it sounds pretty cool, right? Sounds right. And once we see the world as composed of matter and energy, then we presume that we need to be composed of matter and energy, just like everything else. And then even when people come up with a theory of mind, right, and even infants and young children have a theory of mind according to normal science and philosophy, and they do in a sense, but the theory of mind is this default thing that our brain comes up with, which is that like people or some objects, we could put it this way, some objects, and this again is incorrect, but it's kind of, I'm describing the default way in which we interpret the world, starting from a young age. Some objects are people. People have minds, right? And people like have feelings. But so I was having a couple of thoughts at once there. They collided. And nothing came out. I was going to say, one of the things I was going to say was that, sorry, they keep on whacking into each other. Let me just stay with my train of thought here. So by default, without even realizing it, people think in terms of matter and energy, and people ask, where are things? Like Plato would try to figure out, like, where are concepts, right? Where does liberty reside? right? Liberty being a concept. And then he would come up with maybe there's this like realm of forms or something like that. And really, even though his idea doesn't make a lot of sense, neither does any other idea of where concepts reside. Like if we ask whether Middle Earth, right, the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings, where is it? If we say that it doesn't exist whatsoever, then there's some sense to that. It doesn't exist in like this idea of the real world of matter and energy. But if we say like, what is Middle Earth composed of? We could say, well, I guess it's made of ideas, right? But the strange thing is that if we start to talk within about stuff in Middle Earth, we don't really refer to things as ideas. We end up referring to them as like matter, energy, people, right? We'll be like Gandalf is a wizard and he did this, and they walk over here, and Frodo and Bilbo, right, have this ring. And so we end up referring to it in terms of what amounts to matter and energy. I know I'm not getting to a conclusion yet. I'm just kind of poking around with you a little bit. So I'm a little bit still doing what I was doing with these three things for a moment, is if we try, but I'm getting beneath all these things in a sense, but I'm showing that if we start with a starting point of the world being made of matter and energy, then we keep coming up with to dead ends with stuff. When we, including all those three perception and reality answers: naive realism, representational realism, phenomenalism, like your mind just creates stuff. Phenomenalism is kind of like throwing our hands up in the air and saying, well, maybe matter and energy is like a creation of our minds, in essence, right? And that our minds can like manipulate it directly and so forth. So phenomenalism, I guess, is like saying, well, maybe mind is primary. And then out of mind kind of comes matter and energy. But that doesn't really make sense either. So what actually is coherent, once you get it, once it clicks, and you don't need to feel confused anymore once you have this, and you'll have something unique that other people don't have. You'll in essence, just like me, want them to have it because the benefits are so great. But until, as I mentioned, until they do, then you having it will mean that to the extent that you want to compete with anyone, you can pretty much outcompete them in any kind of place where you have any chance of doing so. Like if it's a very restricted, if there's a foot race in the next month or maybe ever, you won't be able to outrace everyone. But in any kind of playing field in which you're at all equal or not totally behind other people, then you can outcompete them with understanding fundamentally these things properly. And just practically speaking, in your relationships, you can be so differently, have all kinds of benefits. And business and making money really just so much of it is dealing with relationships. And then once you include your own mind and dealing with your own mind, then your infrastructure, your learning and stuff gets done. So if you can learn stuff, be creative, figure stuff out, problem solve, and plus deal very differently and powerfully with relationships, then making money becomes very differently doable. Or making a lot more becomes doable. So let's just go straight to the right answer then, and I can start to bounce back and forth and compare. If we start by basing reality, but I had to talk about matter and energy, otherwise people just keep on going back there. There's like this norm, this magnet that keeps pulling people back to matter and energy. So let go of everything for a moment, so to speak, and let's just think in terms of our consciousness field to start with. Okay, so first of all, let's get clear on consciousness field. I'm not talking about something shared in between people. I'm not talking about, there's all kinds of ways the word consciousness is used in ways that I don't mean right now. All right, so I have to use some word, and I could use a wholly fabricated word like, figlet or something. But I'm using a word that consciousness as a part of it, right? It's a two-part word, consciousness field. Once in a while you might have heard these two words put together. Mostly you haven't, so that's helpful. But it can be easy to try to interpret this not quite how I mean it. So let's try to pin it down right now a little bit better than ever before, perhaps. I'm talking about, again, it's something that is actually the most concrete thing for you. It's the most mundane. It's the most practical. There's nothing new age. There's nothing metaphysical about it. It is. I'm talking about what you experience. Even adding in the moment doesn't really matter, because what you experience, it doesn't matter to say whether you experience it in the moment or in the present or not, right? What you experience is kind of biologic. It's the present. But yet, on the other hand, you actually experience, in essence, like a slice of time. And don't worry about other meanings of time for now at all. Remember, we're trying to just stay within our consciousness field for a moment and not think about how it relates to other stuff. Because the problem is you'll start to blend in some incorrect concepts for a moment if we do that. I'm going to try to build correct concepts together with you. And if you import anything in to start with, that can taint stuff, right? Just like when you're doing chemistry in a lab, if you have impurities, then that can mess up your experiment. So let's try to keep the impurities out by just focusing here. So let's see, I was saying that within our consciousness field, we actually experience time and motion and color and so forth, right? Forget about what time really means. I'm just saying that we kind of, interestingly enough, we kind of feel a sense of time. So there's a way in which we want to let go for a moment about thinking about whether or not we experience things in the present or not, and just get a sense of we experience stuff. Anything that it turns out we experience is again, that could be misinterpreted, but that's what I mean by a consciousness field. So to give you some hints for us to communicate, color, when you look around physically, which I'm doing right now, everything you experience seeing, that's part of your consciousness field. It can be, of course, it can be related. We immediately try to think, well, how does it relate to the world? How does it relate to reality? What's really out there? Letting go of that for a moment and not asking that question about how it relates to conclusions. We're just trying to get a sense of, metaphorically speaking, sort of like the premise right now. If we keep leaping to a conclusion, and our mind, that's what our mind tries to help us leap to conclusions so that we can survive. Our mind is trying to help us tread water. We're trying to do something in addition to treading water here in Alchemy. You can fully remember the first thing I talked about in the first webinar was how we're building something parallel to what we already have. So we can continue treading water. I do too, right, in life, so to speak. And having that be as pleasant as possible and as luxurious as possible and so forth, and help other people do so. But and while we're doing that, we're needing to constantly make decisions and jump to conclusions. Our mind keeps wanting to do that. What we're going to try to do right now is separate out the conclusion, the jump into conclusion, from our consciousness field. So regardless of how far the moon really is, or how far your iPhone or your computer really is from your eyes. But it's, for a second, if we imagine looking at the moon, regardless of how far the moon really is, if we look and we see the moon, we do what we call seeing the moon. We have if the moon is in our consciousness field, then it's still in our consciousness field. And how far away it really is a separate question from how it appears within our consciousness field. It might appear far away. We might also have a conscious thought that the moon is, I don't know, 992 million kilometers, and that might be totally wrong. I'm going by memory. Maybe that's miles. Maybe that's nothing like that. Maybe I'm off by a factor of 100. I could look it up, but it's not relevant. So we could have the thought that the moon is so many millions of kilometers away, and then that thought would be part of our consciousness field while we're aware of it. If we then forget about that thought and think about something else, then that thought is no longer part of our consciousness field. If we turn our head and are not seeing the moon anymore, then that experience of the moon is no longer part of our consciousness field. If we turn our head, but we think about having seen the moon a few seconds ago, then there's a memory that's part of our consciousness field. Right? Constantly, whatever we're aware of, our thoughts, if we feel a pain in our back while we're looking at the moon, then looking at the moon or the experience of the moon is part of the consciousness field. the pain in our back is also a part of our consciousness field. If we feel aware of the fact that a moment ago there was a pain in our back, and there still is, right? And that we think that that pain is going to continue for a little while, then I'm hoping I'm not hypnotizing anyone to feeling of pain. Maybe I should have said a nice happy feeling in our tummy. How about that? So we have a nice happy feeling in our belly, and we feel like we felt that a little bit before, and that we'll feel it a little bit in the future. Then the feeling like that we will feel it in the future. Conclusions, you can for a moment categorize or see conclusions themselves as part of your conscious field, not as true, but as like a suggestion or as a conclusion that someone's giving you. A little bit like if you're teaching a class and someone raises their hand and gives you an answer. It doesn't mean that they're giving you necessarily a correct answer. They're giving you an answer. And maybe that answer is a conclusion to a problem that you gave or an equation, right? But it isn't necessarily right. So you're taking it just as a suggestion or as a potentially correct conclusion. So if you can for a moment take any of your thoughts about how things are as potential conclusions or potentially correct conclusions, but not necessarily true, but they're true as potentially correct conclusions. If you're teaching a class and a student raises a hand and gives you a potential answer or an answer, then that answer exists as an answer that the student is giving, and you're aware of it as being aware as in that way, we could say. So if we separate our awareness of thoughts, our awareness of conclusions, our awareness of visual images, our awareness of feelings, if we separate that from a conclusion about what's real, what's true, for a moment, and we just have a sense of how we experience things. Even me describing this might give us an altered sense of reality. I don't walk around with really an altered sense of reality, but for a moment it might feel kind of even lightheaded. Who knows? But so that's your consciousness field, and as we have a meeting of the minds, which maybe we already do, and maybe you had a sense of it coming into this from other things I've talked about or from your own thoughts. But it is again literally the most mundane thing. It is how things seem to you. We want to differentiate how things seem from being one and the same from how things are. We want to have a separation between seems and is. By default, we'll be drawn back into just to take action and deal with the world, the usual way of looking at things, where we kind of conflate how things seem and how things are. We feel like we get a conclusion. We don't think of it as a conclusion. We just think of it as truth. As we look at a tree, we don't think of, oh, that's how the tree seems. We think that's how the tree is, right? We can go back into that, and we will naturally. We can't always be separating things in this way every moment. But what we can do is be seeking understanding and getting more and more. The more we get our foundation correct, the more we have truth built up, then the more there'll be, the more seems and is will line up for ourselves, is another way to put it. And the more where they don't line up, it won't matter so much. Or we can have red flags on when to wait, stop, and work on it a bit and get it more straight. Okay, so everything depends. Once we have a sense, I'll move on, and then I can answer questions now and in the future, and we can go back and get things even better with consciousness field. But by moving on is yet another way to get a sense of what I mean by consciousness field. So to kind of build off of it. Once we have a sense of what I mean by consciousness field, then we can realize, well, that's our only window into the world. We can also have a sense that free will would mean there's something that we must do that could affect our consciousness field. But then we'd have to ask, well, what is it that we might do consciously that ends up affecting it? But we could also, there's a whole number of questions we can ask that are kind of directly like one step removed from it. Another question is, well, is our consciousness field all that exists? Of course, we can immediately say no, and we act as if the idea is no, and that it's correct, it isn't. But by stopping and asking that question, it'll also help us differentiate. And the most important distinction that I made years ago that opened the door to everything else was realizing this idea of conscious field, asking and immediately answering the obvious answer that's correct, which is it all that exists? No. And then dividing the world exactly here, in the following way. And I'm telling you, people don't do this in all of my experience. So there might be some guy out there doing it right. But I've never encountered it. I've never encountered really anything close to it. Even though people figure out all sorts of great things that I don't figure out, this one thing is not something in people's minds. And I've built everything off of it, so to speak, in quotes, everything. But I built so much off of this distinction. And all that stuff is then unique. And so I have all this stuff at my fingertips that I use. And then practically speaking, I've demonstrated it over and over for myself. I've used it, and it just keeps on being so immensely important. So here's the thing. You start by realizing you're aware of your conscious field, and that's your window into the world, and it's your only window. Then you realize it's not all that exists, of course. And then you divide the world conceptually in one place. And that is between your conscious field and everything else, period. And you don't just start leaping to conclusions about the everything else. You just understand, all right, there's my consciousness field. Anything that I can figure out about the anything else, anything outside of my consciousness field, I need to figure out some way. I need to figure out some way that's built properly off of my consciousness field. I can't just magically leap to conclusions. And again, everything would have to be built. Even the method of building and understanding of what else is out there, I have to build that method based on my consciousness field, based on what something I can know in my consciousness field. Then this opened up a field of inquiry for me, which was, well, what do I really know? In what an easy conclusion to come to is that I know what's in my consciousness field. It took me a while to realize that that's the wrong question, or that there's actually a conclusion sort of built into that I think is incorrect. Instead, your consciousness field is the place where you can find your knowledge, and you can't find it anywhere else. But you're not. You don't have knowledge in a certain way. You don't have knowledge of your entire consciousness field in a reflective way. There's a lot more stuff in your consciousness field than you can really process consciously. Your mind is different. Your mind can process maybe all of the precursor to your consciousness field, just like a computer can do all the processing related to what's on its screen, in a sense. But that just because your mind might have neurons and so forth that are related to each of the parts, each of the pieces of what's in your conscious field right now, all the different parts of your visual image that you're experiencing right now, plus your thoughts, your feelings, auditory experiences, and so forth. So there can be a precursor to all that in your mind, but you're not your mind. So your knowledge is contained within. I'll give you kind of a right answer, and then we'll try to. At least what I've figured out is that your knowledge is contained within big obvious distinctions within your consciousness field. But it's not like when you start to try to work off of the idea that you have knowledge of your entire consciousness field, that's when things also break down. That things don't make sense properly. But when you have the idea that you're somewhere within your consciousness field, you can find things that you do know, knowledge, or a precursor, a starting point, a foothold is a great word. So your foothold for your knowing, for really knowing what's true, is found within your consciousness field. It's not your entire consciousness field, but it's found within it. And so then you need to get a sense of how to operate or how to understand or something. how to identify your foothold and go from there is another way to put it. So we want to identify what's our foothold for knowledge within our consciousness field. And then we use that to start to understand things about what else. Now, the interesting thing is that you yourself as a being lie outside of your consciousness field. So you don't have direct knowledge of even yourself. You have to actually figure out that you exist in essence. And this is different than Descartes. It's different and it's related, but it's different. And he just gave up basically soon after this. But he said, like, I think, therefore I am, right? Well, actually, you don't think. If you say, like, there's a consciousness field, therefore there's something that's conscious of the consciousness field, that's correct. But Descartes was actually identifying with his mind. And so he ended up confusing himself and giving up, as people always do, because once you start with the idea that you're your mind, then you're wrong. And so anywhere you try to go from there, you end up at a dead end. And eventually people just give up because they keep hitting dead ends. They don't realize they need to differentiate things differently. So you don't think, your mind thinks. You, first of all, you experience your consciousness field. You're conscious of your consciousness field. But you figure that out from your consciousness field. Okay, you're not directly aware of yourself. You figure it out. But it's kind of like one step, so it's okay, and it's big and obvious. And I'll be circling back around. The more I build this out, the more the other parts will make sense. So I'm going to make sense of what I'm saying by continuing, not by just repeating myself over and over. Although I do repeat myself, but in addition to repeating myself, I'll continue. So you exist as that which is aware of your consciousness field. And we can call that a being, right? We just put a word to that. The only meaning of being is a thing that can be aware of a consciousness field. The meaning of you as a being is the specific being that's aware of your specific consciousness field. You don't know directly, like instantly, that there's other people with consciousness fields, but you can figure it out. Of course, you already have come to that conclusion. It's correct. But you can also figure it out. Anyway, so there's you. Another very important immediate thing is the idea of goodness and badness and variable sense of quality, we could say, of your consciousness field. So it could be the case that the value or the quality of your experience, the amount of goodness or badness that you experience, is all neutral. But if that was the case, then actually nothing would have any meaning. Okay, and you also pretty much directly experience that that's not the case. It's pretty clearly wrong. So neutral would be, if things were neutral, you would have no sense of, you couldn't even understand what I would mean when I talked about goodness or badness, or why you would do something in order to have more good and less bad. There would literally be no reason to do anything because everything would be, the result would still be neutral in terms of the value of your experience. When I say value, I'm just using a terms that I'm defining as the same as more goodness, less badness. And again, when I talk about this, I'm talking about the most mundane, obvious thing. Find the most obvious, most mundane meaning of what I mean by value of your experience, quality of your experience, more goodness, less badness. Once you're operating based on this distinction of your consciousness field, then you'll the most immediate, big, obvious meaning of goodness and or general quality of your experience is the correct one. People get confused about what good and bad is because their basic idea of the world is incorrect. It's based on matter and energy, and then a mind arising from that, and then goodness almost being like some mysterious thing, and again, our mind reinterprets goodness into that which furthers our goals and so forth, which is totally different. So everything's confused the normal way of looking at things, and you can't really make sense out of things. So people give up. In what I'm giving you, as it clicks, you will be able to make sense out of stuff. It may be confusing, I'm not sure, but presumably it's confusing transitioning to some degree. But really, once the idea of a consciousness field clicks for you, then really the rest of it doesn't have to be difficult, especially with me just giving you answers, questions and answers. But none of that should mean that you feel frustrated because it's difficult or anything. I'm more trying to I'm only saying these things in order to help guide you in the right direction to to understand. None of this is like a moral thing, like, oh, you should get this sooner or later, or sooner or whatever at all. I don't feel that way whatsoever. Um, but I mean, like, looking for kind of complex answers, or if there's confusion, is probably because you don't yet have the distinction about the consciousness field kind of fixed, and you don't really quite fix it in your mind. You have to stop and consciously notice it, because your mind can kind of store the precursor or like a red flag about consciousness field, or like it can store like stop and and be aware, like notice that you're aware of stuff and you're experiencing stuff. But your mind itself is not conscious. It's like this processing mechanism and goal achieving mechanism that's not conscious. So it can't like store the meaning of consciousness field in neurons. So as you identify with your mind, the idea of consciousness field will feel confusing. When you kind of identify with you yourself, who you really are as a being who's aware of your consciousness field, then you can get to where it's not a confusing idea. So let me continue with talking about reasons and stuff. So okay, so wait. So some of the critically immediate kind of one-step concepts that are critical are the idea of you as a being, distinct from your consciousness field, that you don't directly experience, but you kind of deduce it in one step. You can't infer yourself. You infer by looking like around at the world and making like metaphors or extrapolating and so forth. That's how your brain makes inferences. So you don't infer. You deduce it by the opposite is clearly simple and obviously wrong. If we say there is nothing aware of my consciousness field, then that can't be right. So there's something aware of my consciousness field, and there you go, that's you, right, as a being. And the only meaning of being so far is that it's something that can be aware of a consciousness field, or that is aware of a consciousness field, period. That's it. That's the entire meaning of it. And it's built properly. It's built off of starting with the idea of your consciousness field. Second thing is the idea of goodness. And you can even differentiate goodness and badness. Badness can be eliminated, theoretically, where you don't feel bad. And the conscious experience of bad is easily identifiable, right? You just feel bad. It's directly, you feel it in one step indirectly. Almost like green. You don't have to really define green. You just kind of, you identify it. You can put a word to it, but you directly experience green when you do. With bad, you just kind of directly experience it, and you obviously don't want it. You want to eliminate it, ideally. Doesn't help to feel bad about feeling bad, right? But you just want to dissolve it. With good, however, you could have more of it. So you can imagine not feeling bad, but then maybe being able to create and have more and more good. So they're actually two different things. We'll think of it's good to have less bad, but that there's kind of two different meanings. There's like it's preferable to have less bad. But goodness is also something you directly experience, and you can have more of it. You can feel good, or you can feel like really good, right? Or you can feel good in a few ways, or you can feel good. Let's suppose you feel good. Let's say your physical feeling of well-being doesn't change, and then you help somebody else, and you can see that they feel better than they used to. Or even someone you care about gets helped by a third party, and they feel better. The person you care about feels better. Then your sense of well-being, I'm just stipulating, it doesn't change that whole time, right, over the course of an hour, let's say. So you have the same sense of well-being, and then another person that you care about ends up better off. You see, you can feel even better, right? So there's my little demonstration of how you can feel even more good. And that can increase. And in that, there could have been no bad. Like, let's say the other person felt good and then they feel even better, right? And maybe we could understand that even better. Maybe I can, and I try to. and I'll work on it. But that's good enough for now. That really helps. Operating within that just is great, right? Trying to reduce that'll be enough for now. We don't really we have plenty to do, eliminating bad and creating more good stuff that'll keep us busy for now. So there's good and bad, and there's and fundamentally, regardless of even good or bad, there's a variable quality of our existence, and we want to have a higher quality. We want to have more good, less bad. We want that. If other people exist, then we might as well want that for them too. And the reason is, if we didn't care one way or the other, let's say we were neutral towards other people and how they felt, and in terms of their goodness and badness, their quality of their existence. If we were neutral toward that, then we wouldn't feel worse if they felt worse, but we wouldn't feel better if they felt better. So there wouldn't be a sense of potential abundance. Like there's more capacity for us to feel good or to experience goodness if the others exist and we care about them. Do you see? So there's more capacity for goodness. There might be a drawback. There might be more capacity for waste. And that's how the world is. The world isn't neutral. There's capacity for waste where bad leads to more bad. But there's also capacity for abundance where good leads to more good. So another way to understand the basic purpose or the fundamental goal of life is abundance, which doesn't mean plenty. There's a word plenty, which means there's enough for everyone to have enough, right? Or there's more than enough for everyone to have enough. Plenty is a different concept. That's besides the point for the moment. Abundance is the idea of more good leading to more good, wanting more good for other people. And in order to allow for abundance, you have to allow for waste. And that's what's going on. And there's waste going on too, but God didn't screw up. There's just no logical way to create a world where there's a potential for abundance without also creating the potential for waste. So currently we're also actualizing plenty of waste, and we want to stop doing that. We want to actualize just abundance, where we, by understanding more good leads to more good. By thinking in this way, we practically can make more money, we practically can have more romance, more sex, more whatever. So this isn't just philosophy, deep stuff. I'm talking about really the most practical stuff we can think about, even though by default people think of it as perhaps impractical or deep or philosophical. So there's the idea of us as beings. There's the idea of goodness and badness and variability in experience, quality of variability and quality of experience. That's also just critical and fundamental, like two things. Then there's now here the idea, the answer to how reality works. What's reality made of? See, if we don't answer the question of what's reality made of, what's the world out there made of? If we answer, it's answered wrong by default. And that leads to confusion around the edges. It leads to confusion whenever we try to really think about stuff. And so we shy away from it. And it prevents us from coming to all sorts of very important conclusions. It prevents us from operating on our core, basically, on our standards and norms properly. If we do try to think about our core or how we really want to be as a person, or what we want our standards to be, the problem is we're playing on the same playing field as our other standards and norms and culture and other people's, and we're struggling. We're having to fight to want one thing rather than something else, and so forth. We need to get on a deeper, different playing field that's underneath it, so that we can just win rather than just fight on the same level. We need to get to a higher level or whatever. All right, so the correct answer is that the world is not made of matter and energy. The world is not made of concepts or thoughts. When we try to ask where is Middle Earth, we can't come up with a good answer, because we wouldn't say that it's made up of matter and energy, but then what do we say? It's made up of ideas? You could say, well, sure, David, that sounds fine. But then what are ideas made of? And then are they made of matter and energy? If not, where do they reside? In our mind? Well, where does our mind reside? In our head, in our brain, right? But then our brain's made of matter and energy. And in practice, what people keep reverting to trying to build things on top of matter and energy, and even themselves. But that keeps breaking down. It doesn't work. And if I work at it, and I probably will, then maybe I can describe even further how it breaks down and doesn't work. But if we see the correct answer, then that's important too. Otherwise, we have nothing to compare the wrong answer to, and we have issues. But I also want to give you the wrong answer, or else we have nothing to compare the right answer to. We need, we see by contrast. We see by making distinctions. We understand by making distinctions. So, and you can work on this yourself. So, the correct answer is we ask, well, what are things really made of? What can I understand the world to be made of in a way that makes sense out of, now I can answer what Middle Earth is made of, what matter is made of, what energy is made of. God is not made of reasons. Neither are you. Neither is your consciousness field. Your consciousness field is not made up of reasons. But what there are is there's a reason. There has to be so let's ground ourselves again. Okay, in where? Where do we ground ourselves always? In our consciousness field. So we stop and we say, all right, our basis for everything is our consciousness field. So we need to, whenever we're thinking about anything else, who we are or anything else, or what is the world made up of? What is the external world outside of our consciousness field made up of? We have to start by building it off of our consciousness field. So we have to ground ourselves for a moment. So we're aware of what we're aware of. There's our consciousness field. And then we ask, is that all that exists? Well, if it's all that exists, then, again, there'd actually be no reason. There's nothing outside making it be the way that it is. So, again, that robs everything of any meaning. We can notice that we can't just directly make our consciousness field be different, like just through direct willpower. If I just want to experience bliss, I can't just go, okay, bliss time, and it's just permanent bliss forever, right? So we can't operate on it directly. So if there's nothing that we can do indirectly, then we're helpless. There's no meaning to even trying. We just sit there and experience whatever we experience. So the idea that there's no meaning to any action or thought or anything leads to an absurdity. And we can't act on that. We can't live that way. So there's got to be meaning. There's got to be reason. There's got to be something outside of our consciousness field. Oh, and even us, right? There's us outside of our consciousness field. We know that. But there has to be then some reason why our consciousness field is configured the way it is right now, rather than some other way. And so all of that again, we can understand the world in terms of reasons why our consciousness field is one way rather than another way. Matter and energy is like a model to help us understand or picture. Models help us kind of, again, understand, see, act on reasons. And everything comes down for you and me into our consciousness field being different or better, right, or whatever. So once we start trying to think of the world this way, then actually, believe it or not, it actually makes sense. Now the universe, like literally matter and energy, are made of reasons. Reasons aren't made of matter and energy. Reasons don't reside. Normally, the way people think of the world is minds are made up basically of matter and energy, and then reasons live in the mind. And then maybe the world is like God's mind or something like that. That's not how it is. God's aware of all reasons. The universe, as you think of it, it's a model for reason. So, but it's easier to think in terms of like Middle Earth for a moment, rather than the universe, because the universe kind of imports so much impurities into your thinking so quickly. If we think of Middle Earth, then if we think of Middle Earth being made up of reasons and matter and energy in Middle Earth being kind of made of reasons, then we can talk about Gandalf as being a person and Frodo and so forth having a ring that's made of metal, but it's also magic metal, right? That can do stuff. because we can't really talk about what's going on in Lord of the Rings without referring to objects that are made of matter, right? And then objects moving around and so forth. So we find ourselves referring to matter and energy when we're talking about a fictional world like Middle Earth. So if we deny that there's anything to do with matter and energy, then that contradicts the fact that we just keep on using matter and energy as we're talking about what's going on in Middle Earth. We could say that Middle Earth resides in Tolkien's mind, but actually it also resides in our mind. And then in Tolkien's mind, he imagines it in terms of people and interactions, and then matter and energy and physical laws and so forth. I know this could be a little bit tangled as I untangle things. But let's see here. So in the normal way of thinking of matter and energy, if we ask where Middle Earth is, again, we kind of end up with sort of nonsense. Like, okay, it's in Tolkien's mind, it's in my mind, it's in this person's mind, and yet there's some objective reality. Like, we talk about it as if there's some objective reality to it. So David, so then I could, imagine someone asking, okay, so what do you mean like it's made up of reasons? And I've been a little bit addressing that, but let me try to answer that fresh. I'm a little bit poking around here to think of some. The more we poke together, the more it'll kind of fill itself in. So, like physical laws, like gravity, as we think of them like reasons, right? I've referred to it like a computer game will have like a physics engine. Those physical laws in the computer game world, and then this relates to the real world, what we think of as the real world too. Laws can't do stuff directly, right? Like this is the magical thinking that people have normally, is they'll say, well, gravity does this and gravity does that, or when I was reading, people recommended I read the book Social, which is good. I'm learning. There's good science in there explaining stuff. But he'll also talk in terms of evolution. And when you hear evolutionists talk in terms of evolution, they're constantly anthropomorphizing it. They're constantly saying, well, evolution did this. Evolution was clever here. Evolution caused this. Evolution caused that. And then they'll deny, if you pin them down, they'll say, oh, no, of course I don't really mean it that way. But it's when you notice that someone just keeps on doing something like that, then why do they have to keep anthropomorphizing it? It's because their worldview is kind of confused. Like they can't talk without anthropomorphizing evolution and ascribing powers of creation to evolution. Like evolution does this, and even powers of like intentionality and purpose. And again, they'll deny it till they're blue in the face. But then whenever you look at what they actually say, it's constantly they're using language of intentionality, and again, even anthropomorphizing like evolution's almost like a person doing something, or at least something that can cause stuff and do stuff. Even the same thing with gravity. They'll be like, gravity does this, gravity does that. Sorry, sometimes explaining why something is wrong is a little bit odd to do, because you kind of get into a bit of an absurdity. And if I say something that seems absurd to me, and if I'm worried that other people don't see it as absurd, then that's where I kind of get blocked for a moment. Again, I'm admittedly just kind of poking around here a little bit to kind of bridge this in different ways. And I'll go to the discussion in a moment, but let me just keep trying for a little bit here. So when we talk about the visual image of the tree, and we ran into a problem with the idea that I see the tree as it is, that doesn't work. That's naive realism. I see a visual image of the tree, that doesn't quite work, because how do I know anything about this tree that I'm supposedly seeing an image of? If what I understand is that I have a visual experience, and that and that external to my consciousness field, external to my visual experience, right? Your visual experience is contained within your consciousness field, right? So the visual experience, you can call it an image if you want, visual experience conveys, I think, pretty well what I mean. A visual experience, that we would say a visual experience of a tree, that resides, that's part of your consciousness field while you're aware of it, okay, while you're having it. So now we can identify where that resides. How about the tree that's out there? The other things that I covered couldn't give a good answer to that. How about what I'm saying is alchemy? With alchemy, I say there's a reason why I'm having a visual image that I would say of the tree, rather than some other image, rather than having no image at all there, whether it's kind of like a blank space or just seeing grass but no tree there, or rather than seeing the tree looking differently. And then say, well, so there's reasons for the image to be one way rather than another way. Those reasons, this is why I call this alchemy. The reason why the image is what I experience rather than something else is actually a whole bunch of factors that mix together, thus alchemy. So there's the model of matter and energy, which is a real model, right? Like there's really something going on that we call the universe. But again, it's made out of reasons, but the reasons exist. They're not just random, and they're not non-existent. So they're specific. Just like in a computer game, there's a computer game world that's encoded within the code for the game, right? And the computer game world, or Middle Earth is a certain way. Now, there might be a gray area where people might disagree about this or that, but if we define it as the world of Tolkien, then we could look in the book and we could verify that some things are true and some things aren't, right? If we say, are there Jedis and Ewoks in Middle Earth, we could say no in a coherent way, in a way that makes sense. Someone, if they really wanted to, might try to argue, but the reality is that we could be quite certain. It's not a nonsense question. We could answer very confidently and with a good reason. We would have reasons why there's no Jedi and Ewoks in Middle Earth, right? That's in the Star Wars universe. So similarly, there is a physical world that's encoded, that God's aware of, that's encoded. But again, it's made of reasons, there's a model that we can make of it involving matter and energy that works. And that model is going to be similar to the model that God has. And you could say, well, David, now you're just importing God and you're just saying God exists and not even backing that up. Let me see if I can address that. Well, I mean, once we see the world this way in terms of reason, something has to be upholding, able to change consciousness fields. Since your consciousness field, or make them in the first, since your consciousness field exists, it's configured the way it is, something needs to have the power to make it exist in the way that it does, in the configuration that it is. Reasons, actually, when I talk about reasons are different than causes. Sorry, I understand this well. I'm trying to make sure I explain it right. And again, this is the coherent view of the world that actually weirdly does make sense if you fit it together. Well, and again, to give the correct answer, there has to be basically one God that can cause consciousness fields to be that. I know I'm asserting this, but I'm at least giving you an answer that then we can talk about in some way. But this has nothing to do with religion. This is just your consciousness field. I'm just talking about what's going on with it and what the world is made up of. And again, this will matter very much, because unless we see the world foundationally properly, we're not going to be able to get underneath our self-image, our super goals and meta goals of our norms and standards and so forth. So this is very practical and necessary. Your consciousness field, there has to be something that can make your consciousness field, and that makes it. Now, that something can cause your consciousness field, but that something is going to have a reason why your consciousness field is the way it is rather than some other way. The reasons don't make your consciousness field. The reasons are reasons why something that is able to make your consciousness field makes it the way that it does and not something else, some other way. That's coherent. That is how things have to be. If someone says, well, maybe there's nothing that's responsible, or if someone says, well, maybe the universe is the reason, the trouble is, as soon as someone starts to try to operate on that, well, let me ask you, is the universe aware of what it's doing? If the universe is not aware, then what's the connection between, how can something that has no awareness cause a consciousness field to be one way rather than another way? Again, it would have no reason. Something without awareness can't operate based on reasons. And when you start with the normal way of looking at the world, that it's based on matter and energy, then it can feel like these things could maybe happen. But it's all nonsense. If you look more closely at it, you can't. Like, you start to look closely at it and it just stops making sense. You'd be like, well, the universe can just make your consciousness field in. All right. So is it aware of doing so? No. All right. It's not aware. So it has reasons. You're like, sure, reasons. The forces, matter, energy, gravity, and stuff like that. That's the reason why you have a consciousness field is gravity. It's like, so gravity is part of the universe. And I say, does the universe move? Like, yeah, it moves. Like, it changes, right? The universe changes. Well, if it changes, it no longer it's gone. It changed. It's different, right? If something changes, it's different. It's not the same thing. So now, what's the universe? Is it the configuration that the universe is configured now? Because actually, that'll change, right? Next moment, according to this person's own belief, their own view of the world. Well, if it changed, it no longer exists, right? Something new is there. So that new thing now creates your consciousness field, not the previous thing. And it just kind of is nonsense after nonsense. What is it about the universe that can make a consciousness field? They say the universe is composed of energy and atoms, right? Or fundamentally energy. So somehow what? Energy wiggles in one way, and now you have a consciousness field that like, what does energy do? Like, what's the any kind of logical connection? With the idea with alchemy is that reasons interact with each other and combine. Okay, if you have a situation like a person, in the sense that you think of a person, which is really like their mind, or that when I say you, or kind of, there's a way to understand a person's mind is composed of reasons. It's a mixture of all sorts of different reasons, different. We can once we start with the idea of reasons, we can have the idea of a physical world, just like even in a computer game, if we're coding for it, we code. I don't do coding myself, but a person would have to code for the physical world in that game, right? If they're in a forest or there's buildings or whatever, that has to be within the code of the game. So in the case of a computer game, you start with the idea of code, and then you get more specific. You say, okay, this is the code for the physical world. This is the code for the physics engine, which is related to the physical world, but the physical world of the computer game is kind of the default thing, and then there would be maybe what shows in the person's computer screen, and then based on inputs and the physics engine and the physical world code, then it all combines and mixes, and it comes up with what's going to show on the screen next frame, right? It would have to be a mixture, an alchemical mixture of inputs, which are converted to code, like from the controller or the keyboard. It would have to involve the physics engine. It would have to involve the previous configuration last second, and then there would have to be a backdrop or a background, right, or an overall idea of the basic physical world that's kind of static, that gets referred to as well. All those things mix together and cause what's going to come on or not cause, but are all those reasons combined end up being what end up combining, and that's what leads to what's on the computer screen. The reason I'm getting into cause there is that whole system of the computer and the computer game, that itself is a system within the physical world. And you say, well, David, I thought you said the physical world is made of reasons. Yeah. So there's a physical world. The physical world is one of the things that you can make out of reasons. You can make Middle Earth out of reasons, which is not in the physical world, but it can still be made in a way that has a coherence to it, that you can discuss. And it pulls from the idea of matter and energy as part of it, right? And it pulls from the idea of physical laws, but then it creates some of its extra laws on top of it of magic. So now we understand that the way that we perceive reality is we have a consciousness field that we're directly aware of. Within there is going to be our foothold for knowledge. There has to be reasons why we're experiencing what we're experiencing rather than otherwise. Those reasons open up a massive world of, we can call it complexity or interesting stuff that we can delve into to try to understand it better. So the more we understand about the world of reasons, which is greater than just the physical world. You see, with the scientific mentality, the idea is that the physical world is pretty much all that exists, and we mostly ignore the rest. Or we just sort of have the rest as kind of an add-on, like mind and so forth. But mostly we just try to explore the physical world. Or, that's kind of a scientific worldview. Practically, the way people operate is they really operate as if relationships between people are fundamental to reality. And really, we base our money getting, we base a lot of our quality of life on relationships almost being foundational in a certain way. And then there's kind of this confused duality between the physical world is like what's basically real, but then we have this social world that's actually, in practice, it's almost like more real or more important, and it really is, like in essence. Right? But then sometimes the physical world becomes more important in the sense that you can only make cell phones, for example, and everything they can do, and computers, by understanding the physical world better. So exploring the physical world and the reasons involved in that come up with incredible scientific inventions, and that's terrific. And I have nothing but applause and appreciation for people that do that and have figured that out. And I haven't done anything like that. Then there's all kinds of understanding social world, and then that relates to mind and goals and so forth. Practically speaking, for most of us, learning more about the physical world isn't where our benefit's going to come from. Mostly we just buy stuff from people that do, right? Unless a few of us really delve into that and we discover stuff. Or Greg does that with reverse engineering the Google algorithm, right? And Greg is an example. Of course, other people do it and other coaches do it. And doing that science is terrific. Some of us do science. Most of us benefit from people that do science. They're exploring the physical world. But if they understood it in terms of reasons, they could actually do it much better. I'm just kind of asserting that for now. I can't really explain that, although everything I'll talk about will kind of shed light on how they could do it better. But practically speaking, for you and me, for nearly all of us, the benefit that we're going to get in life is going to have to do with exploring concepts, minds, goals, super goals, these norms and standards, things like that. The real social world is where we're going to make our income, we're going to get our romance, our sex, our friendships, all kinds of good stuff is there. So when I talk about the physical world and stuff, I'm more just have to be complete, right? And show how it all fits together. And also show the error of when we try to build our understanding of mind off of the physical world too much. Now, when we look at the brain and what lights up in the brain of neurons, that can help provide insight. But people that don't have alchemy as a concept, I don't just mean this course, but as a concept, they veer off into all sorts of ridiculous conclusions, and they mix in an incorrect idea of evolution and evolutionary theory, and in a way that on the face of it is ridiculous, where they start to anthropomorphize it and talk about it does this, it does that, and they try to make predictions based on that and so forth, and it limits them, as if like the main, and then you have these kind of different camps where a few people in philosophy or psychology will try to keep bringing in the mind and people's experience, and then other scientists will kind of ignore that, and or only they'll kind of treat people's experience as sort of what they report, or what could be measured in their brain. What they report is known to be incorrect in a lot of ways. Like if people report the reason why they do something, that'll often be incorrect. But then so scientists will say, well, that's incorrect. So instead we go by actions they take or neurons that light up. but there's so many things they could figure out if they had a more expanded, unified. In essence, I'm getting a unified field theory of success of existence. I don't have a unified field theory of the physical world, of physical forces, and that could be maybe figured out, and maybe it couldn't, maybe if it exists. But I have an even more fundamental unified field theory that I'm giving you now, which is that it's all made of reasons. Once we have that backdrop and we stop accidentally constantly thinking in terms of building off of matter and energy, which is we're so used to, or our minds are so used to, then I can explain things better over time as I continue with you guys. But otherwise the duality or the confusion of constantly importing the taint of building things off the wrong foundation will keep coming in question after question, thought after thought. And I expect this to not make complete sense yet or whatever, but I do also expect it to have started to create a wedge or something that we're building where I can keep on building it out and referring to it and showing you from this way. And as I continue to show the method of knowing what's true, then it'll be built off of this. And people would keep getting themselves confused by making these perception and reality mistakes. And the idea of trying to relate things to being made out of matter and energy without even phrasing it that way. Or they'll say, where is? The other thing about matter and energy is that people think in terms of space. Space exists like as, well, it exists as a reason within a model of the physical world, and it also exists as an experience within our consciousness field. But when people say, where is it? When people say, where is mind? They confuse themselves, right? Because they implicitly, they start, what that means to them is that where within like the universe is mind, or where within the universe is Middle Earth. And again, they'll think like, okay, well, in the universe are bodies and objects. Some objects are people. Some people or all people have minds. Within Tolkien's mind is Middle Earth, and then he shares it, and people that read it, then Middle Earth gets into their mind too. But that's not exactly right. Something similar to that is right once you build it off of the idea that it starts with the world of reasons. But the universe itself, people think of the universe as like this hard reality of atoms and so forth. It doesn't exist as a foundation. It only exists as being made of reasons, not made of like rock or hard stuff. And once you learn to see things that way consistently, it actually makes great sense. It's so the world all just, it kind of weirdly easily makes sense. Again, I don't know how the transition will go, and that's why I'm scheduling time and discussion to do it with you guys. And maybe we'll have some webinars devoted more entirely to discussion within this. Okay, that might be good for me, just kind of talking in the absence of feedback for now, and I'll just talk to you guys a little bit, and then we will be done. And as always, we'll continue with this. None of these are. I wouldn't have scheduled all these webinars, as I always say, if I thought that if my goal was to get closure in one of the, and just, already. Not that I would mind. If I could figure out a way to get closure today and explain it all, then I would have. By the way, I'm not trying to slow roll things either. But I understand that we haven't covered it all yet. But I think we've made progress for sure. Whether or not it'll feel that way. But I suspect that it'll feel like some progress as well. All right, let me go to the very end just to start with. What does BCFR mean, Shelley? That which is unified field of existence of reasons, yeah. Megan Lee, yes, reasons and combining them makes so much sense as a foundational understanding brings clarity. Is this the foothold to understanding of all the rest? Well, yeah, consciousness field to start with. I'll give you another thing next week because we'll have kind of a self-contained lesson on Monday. But yeah, or it's part of the real bottom line foothold is there's kind of a combination, I would say, of consciousness field, you as a being, reasons, the idea of reasons, the idea of good and bad residing fundamentally in your consciousness field. That sort of thing provides the sort of baseline foothold. And there's a bit more that's really going to be pretty foundational and fundamental that I'll be covering next week, in terms of where exactly and how is that foothold for knowing within your consciousness field. Of course, I've been kind of using it all along. We've been touching on it all along, but I'll be pretty specific about it and delve into it from different angles next week. Beings. Oh, thank you. I should have realized. Being conscious field reasons. Great, great. It seems like at least to some of you that this is starting to at least have a sense like it can give you a different way to build things. And of course, I can testify that it really works out great building things this way. So if God made our consciousness field, and God makes our consciousness field every moment. If God made our consciousness fields, and I realize that's an assertion. I can tell the difference between an assertion and something I've developed and clearly explained. But although I've explained it a lot at this point, if God made our consciousness field, but I'm never trying to impose a truth or an opinion, either an opinion or a truth on you. Always what I'm trying to do is help you to lead you to understand for yourself. So don't ever interpret me making a statement as me trying to impose it on you or me acting like you should already get this. I don't think you should already get it. I think that it's better if you understand it, of course, and if I understand it. So if God made our conscious fields, why did he make them so inadequate? In one sense, the answer is it isn't necessarily inadequate. God's limited by logic, in essence. There's different potential meanings to that, and I only mean one of those meanings. But God couldn't create the potential for abundance, for where we have free will and we have a way to affect other people. See, if we couldn't affect other people at all via the world of reasons and then into their consciousness field, then we couldn't love them. Think about it, right? There wouldn't really be any connection between us and other people in essence. So in order for us to have love as like an action, then we would need to affect other people. And what God ended up doing is giving us a default mechanism that allowed us to like tread water. And then if we were just content with bad, which people are, without realizing it, if people think that bad should exist, that some things or some people, including themselves, should feel bad, then we get that. But there's a basic idea that needs to switch for people if it hasn't switched for them yet. And that is that there's no such thing as that you should feel bad. One other way of understanding faith is the faith that you do not need to experience bad as you seek to understand, as you seek that there's a path, there's a way to not have bad, then I think the world is rigged so that it doesn't have to be that way anymore. So basically, in order to allow for abundant goodness, more goodness that we can participate in terms of caring about other people and affecting them and creating good for them, then God had to create the capacity for waste. That's the best answer I can give to that now. If the universe is made of reasons, whose reasons and why? Reasons don't have to necessarily be whose reasons. The why is so that we can have abundant goodness, more and more goodness. Again, which I already addressed. A lot of the reasons, sometimes people will say a phrase like, well, I think everything happens for a reason, and they'll actually mean something that's wrong. What isn't going on is that God is choreographing all the details all the time. Actually, it's not what's going on at all. God is, and I know what I'm talking about, God I'm asserting here for some of you, but I'm trying to just at least tell you what the answer is so that you can reverse engineer it and we can reverse engineer it over time together. I was saying though that God is not choreographing things in the sense of he's like, okay, I want you to feel pain right now. I want this bad thing to happen. I want that guy to get cancer. Or I want that 4-year-old to die so that the parents will learn a lesson about love. People will conclude that to try to make themselves feel better. But really what's going on is that God upholds like physical laws and so forth. And if God didn't uphold like rules for things, God's like the ultimate libertarian in one sense. Um, if God didn't uphold laws in a way that wasn't just total chaos, then we wouldn't have any way to operate. If there was no connection between one thing and the next, you can again imagine in terms of a sports game or a computer game. If there was a guy controlling the computer game, like the coder, but if the coder could interact every moment and fix everything every moment, then you would end up not being able to do anything in the computer game. There wouldn't be any meaning to any choices that you make, because wherever you aim the gun, if the coder was in the present controlling things, and he adjusted your shot so that it shot the bad guy every time, then you just do whatever. If you ran out of ammo, then the guy just gave you more. Then the coder controller, the godlike guy here, just gave you the ammo, and so the rules wouldn't matter to the game. The coder would just keep fixing everything. And if you say, well, can't the coder just fix a few things? Well, then where's the coder going to draw the line? If there has to be a reason why the coder would fix some things and not others. And there could be rules for that, but they would have to be rules themselves. They have to be regular. If there aren't regularities, then there's chaos, and the problem with chaos is it strips you of your free will. If there isn't a connection between choice and consequence, you don't have choice. It's kind of a simple way to put it. So a lot of what's going on is it's a cascade of reasons based on the physical laws and the consequence of those, or concepts and combining them. But what we want to do is understand or believe or have faith that bad doesn't have to exist. And the sooner you do that, and the more pervasively you do that, the more you can dissolve it. Rick wrote, hi David, great info as always. How is my consciousness field related to the universal mind concept? And how do I best access this universal mind, God, infinite intelligence? How do we reach a higher level of consciousness? Okay, mainly you could just ignore all that and just go with what I tell you, and you'll do everything right. But it's the useful thing about asking that is it gives me more ability to distinguish and clear things up for you. Any sort of universal mind is just more like a physical world that that's a bunch of reasons that we're interacting with. Think about it like this. So we specifically have a mind, like a being has a consciousness field. A being also is attached to a mind. Where does the mind exist? The mind exists within the world of reason, just like everything, just like not everything else, but just like everything except for beings and consciousness fields. The mind is in the world of reasons. That mind is connected, not physically, but it's logically, it's attached to it's part of the reason for your consciousness field, but it's specific to your consciousness field and not others directly. That's your mind. Your mind, there's something you do as you interact with your conscious field as a being that causes your mind to explore in different ways, to focus in different places, that space is created and so forth. That will lead your mind to different conclusions and better conclusions if you seek in the right way. Your mind then partly controls your body. Your body does stuff, says stuff. Through communication, you're communicating with other people's minds, and you're also rearranging the physical world, right, as well. And then that affects their consciousness fields, and then that creates a feedback loop that feeds back into your mind. Like as you communicate with other people, that'll affect other people. They'll communicate back to you. That'll have an effect on your mind. Like other people's communications has an effect on your mind and back, so your mind gets affected that way. And then, but there's some things you can understand where you're no longer affected by communication from other people, because it's no longer an open question. It's no longer a gray area for you. So that cuts you off from being affected from bad ideas from other people in various ways. Let's see. How do I best access this universal mind? What you want to do is not be primarily thinking about how do I access the universal mind. Instead, you want to ask the right questions by seeking. So as you ask better questions, spaces and get open that are defined in a certain way, to like a receptor for certain answers. And those answers will get answered. When you open up the right space, when you ask the right question, then you're doing the same thing as what you're referring to as accessing the universal mind and God and so forth. But basically, if you ask the right question specifically enough, which happens, you actually consciously lead your mind to ask better and better questions. You can think of it like your mind asks the questions, but you, by seeking, lead it to do so. And better questions lead to better answers, which lead to more understanding of what leads to good and more dissolving of contradictions that lead to bad. So again, you do what you're talking about with accessing universal mind by asking better questions. What you don't want to do is think in terms of just finding a source that just gives you all the right answers, where you're basically reverting to naive realism, where you want to find something where you just look at it and it gives you truth. What'll give you truth is the right question that's specific enough. That's what gives truth. The right space that's defined right gives you truth, gives you goodness. Gives you truth, which leads to goodness. So instead of looking for a source, you want to keep asking questions and building to new questions that are then built off of good questions. And there's your method. Instead of a source, what I'm about to say is very important. Instead of a source, you want a method. Looking for a source will keep you forever locked out of looking for a method. And it's probably correct, it may be correct, to say that basically everyone's looking for a source outside of alchemy, outside of what I'm trying to show you. People keep defaulting back to the source. Every movie is like about an artifact, like to save the world. I'm sorry, I know not every movie, but movies that relate to like saving the world, it's always an artifact. Or when people want to find truth, they look for an oracle or a source. It is fine to think of, here's the thing, the universe you can think of like metaphorically like the internet. The internet has all the answers, but it also has lots of wrong answers and lots of irrelevant information, right? So if you just find the right question though, in just the right way, but if it's too open-ended, it needs to lead to more specific questions. If you ask a general question, you'll get answers, some of them are wrong. Then you need to delve in further into those general answers and get more and more specific until you get clarity. And I'll be developing things that'll help you in future webinars. But kind of giving you some answers that can somewhat help you now, somewhat help you know what to look for in future webinars and so forth. But I think what I just explained there is very helpful in and of itself now, and also it'll really help you to understand what the value is and what I'll be talking about in the future. So not a source that just gives you all the true answers, instead a method. Even something like the Bible, no matter how true it might be or how true Jesus' words might be, you still want a method to ask the right questions to get to get the right meaning and so forth from what Jesus said. But what you can use from Jesus' words is it helps you to get the right questions. If you look at Jesus' words in that way, and that's what I mean about like breaking your mind. Breaking your mind and learning to ask the right questions is actually similar. At first, you can use me to help you ask the right questions, but then I'm also giving you answers pretty well packaged, but I still have to poke around and work on bridging it still, right? So you need to use what I say to start with to ask the right questions. As you ask better and more specific questions, then even from re-listening to a certain webinar, you'll get a better answer from the same webinar. And then you can also just ask better questions in the, and I don't have any problem with the questions. I don't mean that the questions need to be better, but of course, just by logic, your questions will get better and better and more targeted in our discussions, week by week. How can there be a difference between God and beings? Well, a being is aware of its consciousness field. So I'm only aware of my own consciousness field. I'm not aware of other people's, and therefore I'm not God. I can't directly affect my own consciousness field. I can't cause my own consciousness field directly to be exactly what it is. When I'm aware of my consciousness field, one of the things that's very clear to me is that I didn't know it ahead of time and then create it based on what I knew. So I'm not making my own conscious field. I don't even know what it's going to be, right? If I turn my head, I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know exactly what it's going to be in an hour. Or I'd have to be aware of my current conscious field plus every bit of the conscious field that I'll have in an hour. If I could know what it's going to be, which I don't. So I don't know what it's going to be like the next moment exactly. So I'm not God. I can't create conscious fields. So God is something different. And I'm not, there's other people out there that have conscious fields, and I'm not aware of those either. So there's a being attached to other conscious field that's not me either. So I'm distinct from other beings, and I'm definitely not God. So that might give you some thoughts about that. But you notice how, well, I mean, at least from, but I kind of stutter a bit, so to speak, metaphor, when I'm trying to explain to you something, but when someone asks me a question where I can just address it from my own kind of model, then I can, these questions are kind of easy for most, there's plenty of things I don't know, but questions about my model, I constantly have a pretty coherent answer. Love this, David. Some great new information. I have spent some time on this subject. Free will is also a factor too, right? Yes. Well, yeah. I mean, free will is a critical part of like the foundational like ideas. You know, being, conscious field, reasons, God, goodness, and right, free will. Again, free. There's no meaning to anything if you don't have free will. If you don't have some power that you have, it doesn't have to be unlimited, and it isn't. But I mean, it's not unlimited in the moment, at least. But even if you have one leverage point, if you don't, then there's no point in anything. There's no point in literally you can do nothing if you don't have free will. Therefore, there's no point in thinking. There's no point in acting. There's no point in anything. And any bad that we experience would just be like torture. Because they're just God making us hurt, or the universe hurting us for no reason. If we couldn't have free will. So cool. I think I answered that. If the universe is made of reasons, does that mean that matter and energy don't exist, or are matter and energy the building blocks of reasons? Okay, neither. And this is where you're getting confused. Matter and energy are real, but they're made of reasons. They're not made of. They're not self-existent. They're not inherent within themselves, and that they're made of something, which is reasons. Let me think. I know I'm just repeating myself there when I say that, but they're not the building blocks of reasons. That's where people get confused. Trying to use matter and energy as the fundamental building blocks will lead you to confusion because it's incorrect. You build matter and energy out of reasons. You don't build reasons out of matter and energy. You could say, well, David, how do you build out of reasons? Well, maybe I can help for a moment. I can give you something that can further help indicate. So you're God, all right? And you are ready to create beings and you realize that abundance, allowing for the potential for abundance, which will have the drawback of allowing for the potential for waste. So to have ever-increasing good, you have to allow for bad. So you do that. So you're ready to do that. You're going to have beings. They're going to have a consciousness field. They're going to be aware of something. It wouldn't be a being if they weren't aware of anything. I mean, there wouldn't be any meaning to it. And you, God, are doing this because you care. You're going to have more goodness yourself as God by having other beings that can have goodness. Okay, just like you as a person, you now, not as God, but you as you, experience more good if there's people and you interact with them and you care about them and they have good. So for the same reason, God can create other people. If you're going to do that, you have a puzzle. So they have to be aware of something. It's a lot like the creator of a video game, actually. If you're making a video game, you need to have something on the screen. Then you need to have a whole set of reasons why what shows up on the screen shows up and not something else. So you need to actually create like a world, right? Even if it's just Tetris, there's like a physical world. What are the blocks of Tetris made out of? This is a great way to explain it, right? The blocks in Tetris or Minecraft, whatever little simple video game, Pac-Man, what is Pac-Man made of? fundamentally, Pac-Man is made up of reasons, right? And then a subset and you can, out of reasons, you kind of form this idea of this physical world like a maze for Pac-Man, or these blocks in Tetris, right, that are falling down. But that little physical world of Tetris within its own little, enclosed world, what are the blocks made out of? Right? Again, they're made out of code, you could say, right? In that world, right? They're coded for. But when you're imagining the code, you can imagine these real physical blocks, or blocks that are pixels, but in one sense, you almost can think of them physically. But the code is not made out of the Tetris blocks. The Tetris blocks are made out of code. And once you think that way, then coding makes sense. If you're trying to if you think, though, that the video game world exists fundamentally and you're trying to code from that, or you're trying to make the code out of the video game world, that doesn't make sense. And yet with the real world, the total universe world, then people do try to do it backwards and nothing makes sense. And then they stop thinking about it and they say that's too deep, and they just keep themselves in this kind of shallow world. Mike Brabo wrote as an answer, they are reasons among other reasons for what we experience in our consciousness field. They're also models for what we create. They aren't the foundations, right? Those are correct statements. And of course, I'm sorry. I don't know if I got that guy. Little mosquito out there. The hatchet's having the webcam on. What are examples of reasons? Well, physical laws are examples of reasons. Again, if we think of computer game code, then what are examples of, and if we rephrase this to say what are examples of code, it's kind of a fun way for you to kind of make this tangible for yourself in a different way, or a way that's kind of maybe easier to picture. You could say, if someone says like, well, what are examples of code? Someone could say, well, there's object-based programming. There's code for objects, and then there's code for how objects show up on a computer screen. Because an object like a gun, when it shows up within a video game, is actually, you can look at it from different angles, right? So that one object exists as code, but then within the code for that gun is also code for how the gun shows up looked at from different angles, right? And then also there's more about that gun. There's a whole bunch of properties that object has, but that object, again, it's made of code within the game. But it's not just a static piece, like it's not something that's just static. It's a whole bunch of rules for how it interacts with situations and different angles that it's looked at and so forth. A tree we could say it's composed of atoms and energy, or that atoms can be interconverted to energy. And then we could say atoms are composed of even more fundamental particles. But at each of those levels, you're talking about a reason, in essence. Pretty much literally everything other than your consciousness field itself and beings is a reason. And it's a reason why. It's a reason that's mixed with other reasons that ends up why people experience what they experience rather than something else. But I'm going to remember that and try to come up with some other answers to examples of reasons that kind of help fill in the picture for you. I'm not fully satisfied with my answer there. So does God need to be consistent in applying logic? God needs to be consistent in applying, like, physical laws, for example. God needs to be consistent in applying rules, and the exception would be still rules, super rules. God literally has to have a reason for anything God does. So God's limited. There's not really a thing that's stronger than God, limiting God. But God can't do something for no reason. God can't do something arbitrarily or whimsically. It's not what you're saying is basically right. I wouldn't phrase it in terms of applying logic. God can't violate logic because violating logic, it doesn't exist. It's no thing. It's not like a thing that God can do. It's not like an action that you can take. It's like 2 plus 3 equals 5. Once you define 2 plus the 2, and then define plus, define 3, and define equals, you must arrive at 5. And then someone could go into the context and change the context that ends up changing the meanings of those things. So once you stipulate the context as base 10 or whatever, or once you affirm that if you change the context as such that it really changes the meaning of 2 and plus and 3, then of course you can change the answer or the conclusion. But if you don't change any of those things, then 5, right? 2 plus 3 equals 5. 5 is necessary the answer, and God can't make the answer be 6. God can make the answer be 6 by changing the context, right? But God can't have the answer be 6 without changing the elements or the context. Once you mix certain ingredients, you must get the result of those ingredients. Or once you mix certain reasons and modifiers, you must get the answer. God can't mix things together or reasons together and get something other than what the logical result is of those reasons. If God wants a different result, God would have to mix different reasons. And God can't like change the rules on a whim for how things work, because God would need a reason for changing those rules. How does the thought that every life, past and present, contributes to Source or God and is all-knowing? How does the thought? Example, children pick up technology so fast, elevating overall knowledge, giving the next generation a service pack update. Okay, so what about the idea that there's like something like a universal mind that's improving? Or like what about the idea that like humanity as a whole is evolving? Well, to the extent that's happening, it's not a very complex idea. It's just so like you can get a universal mind by alchemy, by mixing each mind. I don't mean physically. I mean, or if you were to say, like if minds modify each other, not directly even, minds, if mind, obviously each person's mind, we already see the world in terms of people's mind interacts with the physical world, and the physical world might contain aspects to it or rules that are more than what we've discovered. Like there could, right, there's some evidence, and it might end up being incorrect, I have no idea, but there's some evidence, or maybe there's not, but there's at least evidence can be refuted. But I've encountered some evidence that like people can like all meditate on an idea within a city, and it changes the actual results of like the traffic accidents in the city. Like apparently people can apparently there's experiments that have shown something analogous to not this exact thing, but you get enough people meditating on less traffic accidents in Indianapolis or in a small town, and then there's less over that time that they're meditating, or maybe for some amount of future. So there's still a substrate, a physical or pseudo-physical world, like something like that amounts to a physical world, but that has rules we haven't discovered that minds interact with. Like in this case, for example, we could suppose, I'm not asserting this is true or not, I'm just giving you an example of what could be true, of how something could work. So the meditating, individual people, their minds focus on something that affects something, some vibrational frequency or whatever. Again, I'm just saying this is a kind of thing that perhaps that would make sense out of this. That affects something that can reach in a certain geographical distance based on rules that already exist in the world, right? But that aren't well understood. And then that frequency is picked up by other people's minds that are driving cars that aren't in the middle of meditating, and it affects them, right? Certainly we know that something like this goes on at least just in the normal physical world, where minds pick up on stuff, even just through subliminal. Certainly a mood at a party affects other people. Now that doesn't have to be through some vibrational frequency. It could be through just facial expressions and tone of voices and things like that that are being picked up on, right? But then there's experiments that seem to show that the things where you're not getting a direct visual or auditory experience from people's bodies, that it still affects things. So then there would have to be something that could reach beyond that. But it would still be according to some sort of rules. and then we, would figure out what those things are. None of it needs to be like kind of metaphysical, because we're not basing the world anymore on the physical being foundational. Nothing is meta reasons. Okay, things could be metaphysical, but there's no meta reason reality. There's no reality outside of reasons, and the reasons need to ultimately be coherent. Nothing can happen for no reason. Even magic would have to follow reasons if such a thing existed. I don't fully understand time and the different forms of it yet. I will. I won't try to get into it in this webinar. But yeah, you'll be able, like things like time are impossible to pin down. Even motion, I've referenced, is people have contradictory ideas about motion and the reality of it and where it exists and so forth. Just whenever you try to get deep or get around the edges of how things work, in the normal way of looking at things, you reach absurdities and people kind of give up. But I won't have to make vague, blurry statements. You'll find them, people saying, "Oh, we're all made of energy," or all these ideas, this universal mind. They're all kind of blurry. Like, what does that mean? And it's hard to pin it down. Or this source, like God or whatever. Like, my idea of God is pretty specific, right? That God has to be aware, actually, of all consciousness fields and reasons, and intentional. And so forth. And God's not made of stuff. God's not made of reasons. God's not made, neither of you. You're not made of energy, and so forth. You don't think, your mind does. You're not composed of reasons. You're not composed of the processing of reasons. You're a being. Neither your consciousness field is actually not composed of reasons or matter. It's assembled from reasons. It's a result of reasons, but it's not made of reasons. And that's how, anyway, that starts to differentiate things. That's why also your consciousness field is not made of matter, of course, either. Nothing is fundamentally. But in the world of reasons, you can have a subset of it that deals with matter. And in that way, matter and energy are real. But they're real once you understand them as a subset of reasons, just like a world of a video game is real when you understand it as part of the code of the video game. Then it's real. Middle Earth is real once you understand it based on reasons and built as like a fictional world and how that works and how it can originate in one person's mind and go from there and so forth. And there's some things where if you asked me, well, how is this real or how does this fit in, I wouldn't be able to tell you the answer immediately. I have to think about it. But I have the backdrop to think about it where I can give you a coherent answer, or you can come up with a coherent answer for yourself. Even things like where do concepts exist, or where does mind exist? Mind is a I won't open up a whole can of worms right now, but we can look to address those things. But then we have the proper backdrop to start to answer questions like that, right? The mind, there's something about the mind that you have the brain. Well, once you understand the brain as part of the physical world, which is made of reasons ultimately, right? But a subset, then you have a sense of that. Then you have your consciousness field, which is different. But then you can start to ask, is the brain the brain, which is a part of the physical world. But again, the physical world is a subset of the world of reasons, just like something could be part of Middle Earth, in a sense. But is the brain the only place where the mind is, or the only set of reasons for the mind? Or is there some other stuff going on with the mind? Is the mind an alchemical mixture of the brain and its functioning and something else? But then you can ask those questions properly once we think of things this way, you see. So that's what I mean by we can ask the right questions. And that's a sensible question. That's an intelligible question. Is the mind just the brain, or is it made up? Is it a mixture of the brain and other stuff? And that other stuff would, again, be, we could find it in the world of reasons. The world of reasons has more types of things in it than just the physical world would. trying to build a mind. And then once we differentiate all that from a consciousness field, you can't make a consciousness field out of the physical world. And people try to, but you just can't do it at all. You can't mix the physical world in a way that you end up with a consciousness field. You just have to do that thing like that cartoon where it's a whole equation and a miracle happens and then you get, the answer. Neil Gregory, you said that God creates our consciousness field from moment to moment. Doesn't that imply that we do not have freedom of will? Well, no, because God causes our consciousness field. You do not cause your consciousness field. God causes, but cause and reason are two different things, two totally different things. A cause is something that can directly, through an act of will or power, create or a conscious field or make it be different than it is, change it. That's a cause. A reason is the reason why something like God that can cause a conscious field to be one way rather than another makes it one way rather than another. You have free will in that there's something you can do that goes out there that affects the world of reasons that then changes the reasons out there. It changes the world of reasons. It's a kind of a cascade. It's a chain of reasons, but you can initiate a chain of reasons by seeking understanding that influences the physical world. The world of reasons, including the physical world, often. But it influences the world of reasons in a way where there's a ripple effect, which will affect the reasons that your conscious field is one way rather than another way. So you don't need to be able to cause your conscious field in order to influence the chain of reasons that result in your conscious field being one way or another. So you affect the world of reasons that God uses to, you can call it decide, but it's not decide in the sense of a whim, but that God uses to determine what your conscious field will be next moment and the moment after. And it can affect the reasons why other people's conscious field, right? So us doing this together is going to, if we didn't do this, then our conscious field would be different in the future than if we did do this webinar together. And there's something that I did and there's something that you did that set in motion a chain of reasons that resulted in you being on this webinar, that resulted in me being on it and me knowing what I know, resulted in you being prepared more or less to receive what's on this webinar and so forth. That is all going to affect your conscious field in the future, and it can affect the conscious field of many other people you care about and people you might not even know right now. Can be affected because of a chain of reasons you set by seeking understanding. Or to the extent that you don't seek understanding, then you can close yourself off to good things and keep default bad things popping up that'll pop up by default. You also said that we can't change our consciousness fields, but isn't that what we're all trying to do right now? But I think I answered that right. We don't cause the change directly, but we cause a ripple effect of reasons, which then God uses to determine what our consciousness field will be. You see, it's all coherent, the way I explain it. It might not be understandable, but it's coherent once you get it. Looking for a source will keep you forever locked out of looking for a method. Yeah, exactly, Mike. Of course, you're putting that down, so we have it kind of written down. But yeah, that's a beautiful thing to realize. There's really a lot of blocks, a lot of contradictions and other blocks that we need to dissolve thing after thing. There's a lot of stuff in between us and how things can be. So it just takes some time. Wow, so God didn't give, oh, and I'm sorry to hear that, Megan, and I'll say a prayer for you later. I won't do it right now, but actually, why not? Why not, God? Please touch Megan if she's recovering or recovered, but then, it's always in remission, right? If anything. And if she's not in remission as well, God, please touch and further heal Megan and keep her healthy and happy. Wow, so God didn't give me cancer so I would learn good things. He doesn't intend for good to arise out of bad. That's right. But it was a whole mix of reasons that caused my body to produce cancer based on physical laws and mental and emotional laws. Now, and by the way, Megan, before I read on, you didn't necessarily do anything wrong. Okay, it's just default, right? Bad things happen to little infants. They didn't do anything wrong or not, right? What we can do, though, is make things right over time. I allowed bad actions by others to put me under huge long-term stress and acted in ways that broke the laws. And remember, I already addressed that it's not necessarily your fault But what is beautifully true is that the universe is rigged, the world is rigged, everything's rigged, more than the universe, so that we can get rid of bad altogether, ultimately. And by seeking, we get more good for ourselves and others. But bad comes kind of by default, not just as a consequence of us. Like, bad comes by default, and getting default doesn't get better unless we seek understanding. But realizing the foundations in goodness consciousness, I can understand to not let badness affect me. I don't have to feel bad. By not, what happens is, by taking on the idea that it's not correct that you should feel bad, then we're going to dissolve one of those meta goals I talk about, one of those standards and norms that acts as a magnet that prevents you from like not feeling bad. So the idea that we should feel bad keeps us from seeking how to not feel bad, to seeking to dissolve. So once we get rid of the thing that's that block, that magnet that's pulling us away from seeking to dissolve bad, seeking to understand, this idea that we should feel bad, which is incorrect, is like a bad standard, bad norm, bad magnet, bad meta goal that causes a struggle for us as we try to seek to dissolve bad or understand contradictions. By understanding that it's never true that you should feel bad, you still might feel bad sometimes, but you don't have that extra thing preventing you or struggling against you from dissolving bad. And just from that, it'll be way easier. Just practically speaking, you'll have a lot less bad. You'll be able to dissolve bad much more quickly when you have it. You won't be exacerbating it, and or you won't be agreeing with your mind. Your mind won't be exacerbating it with you agreeing on that. And so forth. And then there'll still be some deep-seated contradictions. I have them. I have issues. I feel bad once in a while. But when I do, I understand that there's something I don't understand that I keep seeking to figure it out. And then I do sometimes, and then that's gone. And then there's more for me to figure out, but I've really come far, at least, however far that is. I've certainly dissolved a whole bunch of things. And I don't mean that in any terms of patting myself on the back. Whenever I say that, I'm just testifying in a way that just can help you get a sense for yourself. But realizing, it'll be like if Greg said, I did this many links and I ranked, number one on the page. It's not that he's bragging. He's just trying to give you a sense of what worked for him in a certain instance. It might take you more links to rank your page just based on the competitiveness of the keyword or where you're starting out or random factors, right? It might take you longer or shorter, but him giving you a sense of what's happened with him, he's doing it to help you get to where you're trying to go. And that's the same thing if I'm talking about myself ever. Okay, but realizing the foundations of goodness and consciousness, I can understand to not let badness affect me, that I don't have to feel badness. Reasons that multiply benefits and basically this is along the lines of correct. It could be interpreted in different nuances, but you're basically correct. And I think you said goodness consciousness in a useful way. It's kind of redundant, but in practice it's useful to kind of repeat these words together to remind yourself for now that goodness resides in your consciousness field. It doesn't reside in your mind. Contradictions and falseness can reside in ideas, but those don't feel bad directly. They can just lead to blocking feeling good. They can lead to basically feeling bad is ideas, but goodness and badness, ultimately they reside in your consciousness field. There's reasons why you feel bad, and the reasons reside in the world of reasons. Does that make sense? The badness resides in your consciousness field, but the reason you feel bad or the reason you feel good resides in the world of reasons, including your mind. Reasons create matter. Be careful how you interpret that. The reasons regarding matter and physical laws, there's a certain way that matter and physical laws are fixed, and we don't like directly impact them through our mind. But then there's got to be a way to get to where the physical world isn't leading to us having an experience of consciousness. So this isn't about like directly affecting the physical world with your mind. That's that phenomenalism I was talking about. So be careful about meandering into phenomenalism. It isn't that this physical tumor is created necessarily with just a problem in your mind. It might be, but I mean, certainly just from science, there's a contributing factors from stress, right, and your immune system being stronger and so forth. But I personally have a hard time making sense of the world for people without explaining that. I can't really find anything that makes sense other than that we have multiple lives on Earth, and I know that's a little weird for some people. I know it's a little bit heretical to like people's ideas of Christianity and so forth, but I can't really make sense of things other than that there that again but the point is that it's not like I know that exactly, so I always remind myself, like I tell you, focus on what you know. There's got to be a way in which badness isn't necessary, and seeking understanding is clearly correct. So fundamentally, the more we seek understanding to understand things, then we'll either cure cancer or we'll get to a point where it's not necessary. God might reorder things at some point. We ask him, or probably the physical laws already exist to get rid of precursors to bad. And we will discover those because there's probably kind of pseudo-physical laws that are still laws that we can discover. But there's a way that science and that discovering just how to cure stuff, like if everyone was perfectly healthy, we'd solve all sorts of problems in the world, right? So ill health can be presumably gotten rid of, but there's a way in which that's still just treading water, where we need to get rid of ideas that are just causing us to fight and argue and just feel bad no matter what, right? People have everything and still could be miserable because of just contradictions that are purely ideological, right? That they have to dissolve. Wonderful, Megan, and I pray that of course that you stay that way. Wonderful. Vincenzo writes, I need help understanding the difference between the consciousness, my field, or consciousness field, I think you might have meant to say, and the consciousness I lose when I get a head trauma. Oh, cool, okay. I see a lot of people unconscious flipping in and out of consciousness, and obviously you're working with a second language in a good way, English being your second language, I presume. Which I always admire because it means not only do you speak this well in English, but then you have at least one other language. My wife, her native language is Russian, and my son actually asked, what's a native language, which is kind of cool because he speaks three of them, right? It was Russian and English, and then we taught him Spanish as well, which is kind of cool. By the third one, he stops having a sense of a native language. He doesn't revert to it, just one, which a lot of kids do when you teach them two. Anyway, this question about what if you lose consciousness. That whole idea is based on the idea that your mind is conscious, or like your brain is conscious. We have no idea whether a being loses consciousness, and basically the way I'm saying it can't really. What it could do is lose a connection. The reason for the conscious field being a certain way, it might get disconnected from parts of the brain or the whole brain or something like that. And then, again, I can't really get away, no matter what someone's belief system is, unless they believe that we literally are just gone fully once we die in this one life. Either whether you have any kind of Christian or Christian-like religion where there's like an afterlife that you go to after one life, or whether there's multiple lives, there's something relating to mind and what you're conscious of that is beyond, that's in addition to just your brain. So one thing that can happen also potentially is your brain could be cut off from being the reason why you're conscious of what you're conscious of, but then the kind of backup mechanism is still operating of like some other mind that's not tied to your brain. And I realize people might not remember, but if people are used to accessing memory stored in the brain, then you could be conscious but not remember it because it's not stored in the brain for accessing later. And maybe there's even a way to remember it that has to do with a different type of kind of focusing or meditating or something that could be accessed. I don't necessarily know how to do that, but And also, if someone were doing that, they could be careful because they could fool themselves, right? You want to always be careful of the source. Memories, including memories just from your brain that feel very true, memories have been shown to be mostly created by the brain based on building blocks. There certainly can be related to past events, but there's a lot of stuff that just gets filled in that might feel very real, but it's not true. So always be careful of sources, and you still want to use a method, especially red flag if you're going to be, doing anything that could hurt somebody else. Then you want to be careful. Are animals reasons or beings? There wouldn't be a yes or no answer to that. Their body and their brain would be in the realm of reasons, right? Just like you're same with your body and brain, or the one that's tied to you, would be in the world of reasons. Whether or not there's a being with a consciousness field tied to their body and brain is a question I don't know the answer to. I don't see how it could be, although still don't look to, buy eggs and meat where they're not like tortured, and so forth, just in case, right? And I certainly wouldn't like kick a puppy or anything, just and as a matter of fact, would want to care for one if if it was there, but I don't want to upset any pet owners or whatever. I don't see how it could be the case, but at the same time, I'm not going to take a risk, within reason. But it's always tough because you're gonna at some point do stuff to people eat a cow or whatever. You can't treat animals on the same level as people at some point, especially as you go into different animals and then you go into insects and so forth. So yeah, anyway. Without worrying about that, we don't know, or wouldn't know directly. I would suppose not, but it's more of a question of, is there a conscious field and a being attached to the animal's body and brain, or is there nothing else there, is the question. And I don't know the answer, but that would be the question. I think Michael wrote, I think you provided a lot of clarity for the group to identify, which may have given cause for more questions, which is good. Thank you, Brother David. You are very welcome. And I agree. I think something about what I said has helped with at least asking the right question and some clarity. And this is also topics that can be covered and talked about that are just based on the normal assumptions people have about the physical world and that don't involve consciousness are pretty easy to talk about. If and when I'm talking about those things, which I'm not doing really in alchemy, most things have to do with that. I guess there'll be particular things we might talk about regarding your offer and relationships and business relationships and various things where they can directly be taken within our normal way of viewing the world, which will make them easy for me to talk about. And then ideally, I like to talk about those things in one sense, right? I like to talk about things like that much easier and more structured, and I can just talk about them and we can get them directly. I'm quite aware of the idea that other people have their own kind of map of reality and their representation of what we're talking about, and whenever we're talking about anything that's at all kind of mundane or built in our normal model of the world, then I can, by that awareness, do a pretty good job communicating about the topics I'm talking about and making them understandable. It's just this one type of topic that is sort of impossible that way, where we have to push outside of it. So I can't by logic, I can't talk within our model of the world when I'm talking about something outside of our model. But what people will do when they're not explaining something well that's inside their model is they won't build a bridge. Like if I was talking about anything to do with search engine optimization, I would make sure I start with something you can directly picture and build from there with each step that you can picture the step, as an example of what I mean. I just can't do that with these topics sometimes. How are we doing here? Pretty good. Alchemy, it's quite reasonable. Thanks, Dave. Bryce, when saying God needs to be consistent, when saying God needs to be consistent, quantum physics works in a logical way by stipulating and changing the context so that the answers make more sense. I'm not sure. When I first read that, I'm not getting a meaning. When God, I'll read it again for myself. When saying God needs to be consistent, quantum physics works in a logical way. So far that has to be correct. by stipulating and changing the context so that the answers make more sense. I'm not sure about that second part of the question right now, but I'll read the second part. Time continues in a thermodynamic, psychological, and chronological way. That is, there's ways to interpret that you very well might mean that are pretty much correct in what you're saying. I won't try to explain it for everyone right now, but you're pretty well on the right track. Yeah, the whole scheme I've given you here with consciousness field reasons and how that works and the being, it's going to allow us to talk about time in different ways. Like when we're talking about something that's within our consciousness field, then there's one set of kind of understanding or reality, or I don't have a good word for it, but it's kind of enclosed within its own set of answers and understanding and backdrop or context. And then when we're talking about the world of reasons, that's a totally different context. And so when we talk about time within that context, then we can differentiate and it'll make sense. When people blend, normally people kind of smush all these stuff together and try to unify a being, conscious field, and the world of reasons, the physical world, all in one big mishmash. And that time fundamentally has a different like meaning within to those different to a being or to a conscious field or in the world of reasons. And if you try to mash them all together, that's why time keeps not making sense when people try to think of it normally. Peter writes, are all reasons that exist perfected? Or could they theoretically be exchanged for another rule or regulation, another backdrop for reality within the same potential for good? Like basically, could physical laws maybe be different, or could there be better physical laws? I don't know. One kind of somewhat interesting thing is that whenever you have like infinite possibilities, then even God couldn't be aware of all the possibilities, because that's what infinite means, is you can't actually have an infinite amount of stuff anywhere, including even in God's mind. God's mind could be unlimited, but it still couldn't be aware of an infinite amount of things ever. So God can't be aware of all the whole numbers, like all the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 to infinity. God can't like picture all those numbers like written on a page. Even God can't, because whatever number God pictured, there'd all be more. So anything where there's an infinite amount of possibility, then even God wouldn't be aware of all the possibilities. Other than that, I don't know a great answer for that, although even just discussing it maybe is a little helpful there. How does prayer interact with the reasons of the physical world? For prayer to work, there would have to be rules that have a regularity to them that are like in addition to the obvious physical laws of like, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, gravity and electromagnetism, right, or the four forces. The way I deal with prayer is that I don't understand it totally, but it has enough plausibility of mattering that I use it to some degree. And just to testify from my experience, a lot of my internal experience is I sort of ask questions like almost like in a conversation with God sometimes, but I don't ask just expecting God to like give me the answer directly, like conversations with God, and then just take it as a source. I don't do that. But it kind of processing things socially. I was reading the book Social. Is kind of a default way that the brain operates. So sort of processing the quest for answers and understanding the world sort of socially with God is a little bit how I sometimes do things, or often do things. I sort of ask questions a bit as a prayer, but not as a prayer where I just expect to be given the answer whole cloth, but just to help guide me along my way and that sort of thing. And I've done that kind of all the way through. Another big internal way that I experience the world is imagining talking to you guys. When I think about what to say, or I'm letting my mind kind of process what to say, and then I think about how to bridge things and examples and stuff, as I'll think about like talking to people, even when I'm not doing alchemy, even last year or the year before. I often think in terms of talking to people about this stuff. And then it's also a lot of kind of a prayer type of interaction with God about seeking understanding and answers and stuff like that. In practice, and I'm not recommending this, it's probably not ideal, but I don't do a lot of praying for other people and like their health. I do some of it for sure, but it's not like a big part of my day or even something I do each day. And other people I do, and I'm glad. And that's a great part of contributing, to life, or just performing actions for other people. Kind of physically, I don't do a lot of it. I tend to spend a lot of my time on this type of stuff. That's kind of where my natural inclination lies, and it seems to be working out pretty well, where some people have different kind of ways that they're kind of geared towards contributing. Thank you, David. This is so good. So much light shed on these big questions. Oh, I'm so glad. That's wonderful. Cancer is a lifestyle disease. I have vast free resources. You are what you eat. Excellent. Good, good. No, and clearly there's plenty of stuff that can help. I always just want to be careful of anything where it's like if we too much say that people have control over something, then we meander into this idea that we start to blame people. Like when people understand karma in an unhelpful way sometimes, where it's like you deserve everything that happens to you, and that's just not the case. You will have more good by seeking to understand what leads to good and so forth. But we don't know where people start, and clearly some people start with better context than others, either ideas or just a physical environment or money or whatever, right? So we don't want to judge people on where they're at or what the results seem to be right now. In a kind of a general sense, we don't want to judge it. We can judge that somebody is acting on a false idea right now because the idea is false. Or we can judge that someone is less effective at playing the violin than somebody else. That's fine, but we want to be careful about kind of judging someone overall. And even with getting a disease, we want to be a little careful of saying that it's like totally created by the person that gets it, or that sort of thing. I might be reaching the edge of my my mental processing right now. My brain might be getting close to burnt out. Let's see how well I do with Chris's thing. It looks like it's pretty nice. Encapsulation. Oh, like encapsulation. What I said. Quote. And this is probably more for people to read later than me to read out loud, but I'll just say it anyway. God, being, awareness, arrow. God created unified, undivided, dynamic consciousness field. Arrow, inclusive of the principles and laws, reasons which are the foundation for this world and its ever-changing manifestation. Yeah, this is it. This is pretty correct. Again, any kind of words like this aren't necessarily. Sometimes they won't bring anything right to mind for somebody, including myself, and they can be interpreted in slightly different ways. But there's certainly a way to look at this that is pretty well on target. My brain might start to blow smoke out of my ears if I keep going. Quite here. Oh, individuals within consciousness field mistake their body. Again, different ways to interpret. I might be able to make some corrections, but or not. Again, I'm perfectly willing to suppose that you have it exactly right. And it's just like any of us, including myself, when I'm trying to represent this with words, it can not always bring to mind something clear. And then the final thing, you are helping people to realize what they truly are rather than what they take themselves to be. Thank you. You're very welcome. And then, again, what we're going to do that's going to be very practical is we're going to be able to build a sense of like a core for ourselves and specifically standards and norms that aren't going to just be based on us thinking. Like, there's a way that when people try to even think about who they want to be, they're still pulling in too much incorrect stuff that they can't really do it as well as they could. And I'm setting yourself up so you can really build a terrific set of standards and norms for yourself that has a strength to it, has a lot of flexibility to it. That basically be stronger where you want it to be stronger, more flexible where you want it to be more flexible. So you'll actually be both more confident and more flexible, stronger and more flexible with your sense of self and then dealing with other people and so forth. Speaking of languages, I have a question. I am trilingual and know Spanish and French. I'm jealous. I know I have one language myself. I am learning Portuguese. When flipping from one language to another, does your brain switch functions, or how does the brain change from one language storage to another? I don't know, but there's a way in which it's pretty cool, right? Because you you're going to see more distinctions. You're going to be much less like a fish in water by having different cultures. Although the danger can be seen in parallel. You can see it with by having two political parties. You have people with different points of views that can argue things in a way that can be helpful. But then the danger is where they agree. Is sometimes if they agree on something, but if that something they're agreeing on is bad, then it's even more seems real and foundational and solid and less likely to be questioned than if there was just the one point of view. So what you want, learning about more cultures. Just this happens with people that, like if people encounter different religions, the danger is where they all agree, but where they're all wrong. So watch out for that. Oh my gosh, it was 3.5 hours. Oh, you're right. I had no idea. I didn't even realize when 3.5 hours. Would you believe it? I had no idea. I go into like a time warp apparently when we're here. Have I been discussing with you for like 2 hours? I thought I stopped the discussion after an hour and a half. That's shocking to me. Anyway, sorry. All right, so we're good. Sorry to keep everyone for this long. It's almost like a drawback because then people might think in the next webinar, if I show up live, it's going to be 3 hours. I don't mean to do that. I wonder if I can ever get it down to an hour and a half. But anyhow, I still might kind of make a concerted effort to do that fairly soon, but clearly not yet. Okay, guys, we'll pretty much wrap it up here. How can I know that I can't know something? That's going to be interesting. I'll keep that in mind. But thank you guys very much, and I look forward. Be here Monday if you can. I know that some of you can't make it because I put it at 8 p.m. Eastern, so some of you overseas might have an issue. But it's going to be really terrific. I'm going to be talking about something to do with playing to win. That'll be quite kind of immediately practical. I'm going to be making a distinction or two or three that are going to be eye-opening, that are not going to be like a cliche type of thing regarding that topic. So I think you'll enjoy it. It'll be kind of like one of those cool, like the effect you get out of kind of like a cool mindset thing that really you like, but at the same time with distinctions that you can take with you permanently. So good. I love the long sessions. Takes a while for my brain to get in gear. Yeah. I like the way I figured out to get warmed up. Not that it shouldn't have been obvious to, would be obvious off the bat to a lot of people. But when I like start with just a slide in front of me without talking to you guys first and just try to start cold, I kind of have a hard time. But by talking just a little bit ahead of time, it's a very nice way to start these webinars. And you get a few minutes. Anyone listening as a recording, if you come on time, then you'll get a little, and live, then you'll get a little bit of discussion that you wouldn't get otherwise. And not really on purpose, just kind of naturally. I'm not going to try to hold something back. If I come up with something particularly important, certainly I'll make sure to say it somewhere that's recorded. Obviously, I'm doing this to help everybody, not just to get attendance on live webinars. But you're very welcome. Yeah, mind blown today, right? Thank you, David. Oh, I hit the 10 million for Peter. Thank you. That's great. Do you guys remember I said that I thought that you guys could look back and at some point, and if a friend asked you if the only way to get this alchemy stuff was to pay 10 million for some reason, just stipulating that, of course, it's unrealistic. If the only way was to earn 10 million to go get it, then would you say it was worth it? And I'm going for you guys to say that that was worth it over time. Of course, that's just a fun approximation that I'm going for. It's not my actual, real goal, but it's just a fun kind of thing. Great way to start the day, absolutely. Thanks, Frederica. Oh, you're welcome, Faith. I'm glad. So we made some progress today, right, with this topic of how to know what's true. And then I'll get into some specific, like more technique-based stuff based on this starting next week. And then, as I said on Monday, in a couple of days, I'll be talking about how to play to win in a certain way. A distinction there that'll be particularly helpful. And something I've used to my benefit greatly that I finally figured out how to explain to people, I think, in a new way. So it's kind of a new thing that I haven't talked about before that I'll talk about on Monday. Okay, guys, take care. Have a wonderful Saturday.